Hey guys, tonight you find yourself awake before the first true light, lying on a pallet that does not so much cradle you as politely tolerate your existence. The straw beneath the wool blanket has gone lumpy in the night. One shoulder presses against cold boards, and the air tastes faintly of old smoke, damp rushes, and the ghost of yesterday's onion pottage. Somewhere above, in soot-black rafters, something small scratches and settles. A draft creeps under the door with the confidence of a tax collector, brushes your face, and reminds you that medieval mornings are not designed for comfort. Beyond the shutter, a bell begins to sound through river mist, low and patient, while a horse in the lane snorts clouds into the winter dark. Your boots wait near the hearth, still edged with yesterday's mud, as if they have spent the night thinking of ways to disappoint you. Medieval travel brochures really oversold this experience, and, to be fair, you probably would not last a week out here without immediately developing strong opinions about smoke, cold porridge, and communal sleeping arrangements. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do leave a comment with your location and local time, because there is something comforting in imagining little points of wakefulness scattered across the dark. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie still a moment longer, not because the bed is good, but because getting out of it feels like signing a contract with the cold. The hearth at the far side of the room holds only a faint red memory under its ash, and the candle stub on the stool has burned down to a lump of beeswax clinging stubbornly to its dish. Beside you, against the wall, rests the carpenter's satchel leather stiff with age, smelling of wood dust, oil, and rain. Even in the dark it seems patient. The way old tools always do. They never hurry you. They simply wait until you understand that the day will not begin without them. At last you push back the blanket and set your feet onto the rush-strewn floor. The rushes crackle softly. They were sweet-smelling once. Perhaps in summer, perhaps in some hopeful week when the housewife laid them fresh with a handful of lavender and a muttered blessing against fleas. Now they smell mostly of damp straw and old feet, which is less poetic but considerably more accurate. A medieval home has many virtues, and crisp interior fragrance is rarely among them. You dress by habit, pulling on your linen shirt, your wool tunic, your hose, and the fur-lined cloak hanging from its peg. The cloak still holds the scent of wet wool from 2 days ago, when sleet found its way through every seam in heaven and earth. Your fingers move stiffly in the cold, and more than once you fumble at a tie or knot. Patience begins here, before a plank is measured, before a tool is lifted, before the town gates yawn open to trade and noise. It begins with fingers that do not wish to cooperate, and with laces that seem to have sworn private allegiance to chaos. Outside, the bell sounds again. Monastery bells mark the dark in ways no clock could yet do for you, dividing the sleeping world into portions of prayer, labour, and half-remembered dreams. Somewhere, men in a priory chapel are already standing in the cold to chant while breath fogs before their lips. Somewhere a baker is raking embers. Somewhere a servant is cursing a frozen bucket in language too practical for saints. All of it begins before dawn, and so do you. You kneel at the hearth and coax yesterday's coals to life. A little dry kindling, a careful breath, then another. Sparks twitch upward like startled fireflies. The smoke hangs low at first, unwilling to commit to the chimney, and your eyes sting. The room fills with that familiar, almost furry warmth of wood smoke and ash. Not heat, not yet, only the promise of it. In a carpenter's life, promises matter. A board promises straightness and gives you a bow. A customer promises payment and gives you an excuse. A winter sky promises clarity and gives you freezing rain. You learn very early to respect what is real and distrust what looks easy. When the flame catches, you set a little pot near the coals and pour in water from a jug. The surface trembles. Breakfast is the sort of meal that would disappoint anyone raised on modern abundance. A scrap of coarse bread, a heel hard enough to suggest a personal grievance, softened in warm ale or watered broth. Perhaps a bit of cheese if luck has visited recently. Perhaps no cheese at all if luck took the wrong road. You chew slowly at the bread while the fire grows less theoretical. And in that slow chewing there is a kind of peace. Medieval mornings do not rush toward you. They settle onto your shoulders one layer at a time. Your tools wait in the dimness: adze, axe, auger, plane, square, mallet, chisels wrapped in cloth, iron and oak, edge and grain, familiar as prayer beads, though perhaps more useful when it comes to furniture. You check them one by one with the thumb along the haft, a glance at the bindings, a small tightening where leather has loosened. The carpenter's craft depends on patience not only because wood resists haste, but because neglect grows teeth in silence. A loose head on an axe, a dulled blade, a split handle no one bothered to rewrap. These are little failures that wait for the cold hour before sunrise to become larger ones. There are people, some swear, who whisper a blessing over tools before first use on the feast day of a saint who guards craftsmen, though no one can quite agree whether the blessing protects the hand, the iron, or the timber. Others tie tiny charms of rowan or ash thread inside the workshop door to keep spiteful spirits from twisting measurements in the night. Those who tell the tale never fully agree on whether wood itself listens. Yet nearly everyone in some half-serious corner of the mind behaves as though it might. A beam cut on an unlucky day, a lintel hung after a quarrel, a cradle made while someone nearby curses. These things are remembered, not always believed, exactly remembered. You finish the bread and drink the last of the warm ale, then wrap the remainder of the loaf in cloth for later. No meal is ever truly finished in a household that measures stores against winter. In a basket near the wall lie onions, wrinkled but sound, and a little sack of oats. Above them hang smoked fish, precious as silver when the weather turns cruel. Winter storehouses are kingdoms of caution. Every cabbage, every onion, every salted scrap means one more day before hunger begins speaking plainly. At the door you pause to pull on your boots. They are heavy, cracked, and damp at the seams despite every effort. Mud has dried in the grooves from yesterday's lane. There is a particular indignity in discovering that boots, like dogs and certain monks, can look trustworthy while secretly carrying trouble. One tug, another, then a muttered complaint into the cold room, and at last they accept your feet. The leather is icy at first. You stand, stamp once, and settle the tool satchel over your shoulder. When you step outside, dawn has not yet arrived, only hinted. The sky over the river is a thin iron grey, and mist clings low among the huts and sheds. The lane is ribbed with frozen mud, each rut holding a pale sheen where water turned to skin-thin ice. Nearby, a dog noses along a midden heap, then glances at you with the grave expression of a creature who has seen humanity at its breakfast hour and found it unconvincing. Smoke rises from a few rooftops. Somewhere farther off comes the creak of cartwood and the cough of a man starting his day badly. You walk toward the workshop yard by habit, head bowed against the air, past shuttered cottages, past a roadside shrine tucked into a niche of old stone where a saint's face is blackened by soot and weather. Someone has left a sprig of evergreen there. Someone else has pinned a cheap pilgrim badge beside it, tin glinting in the dawn's first grudging light. The road underfoot is hard with frost at the edges and soft in the middle, where yesterday's traffic churned it back to muck. This is the ordinary road of ordinary labour, and it asks as much patience as any king's project. Great halls may be remembered, abbey roofs may impress visitors, but every day begins in lanes like this, with cold hands and a cautious step. At the workshop you unbar the door and enter the stillness. The smell meets you first resin, shavings, damp oak, old sawdust, linseed oil, smoke carried in on cloaks, and the faint metal scent of sharpened iron. It is a good smell, the smell of making and mending, of days spent translating tree into shelter. A half-burned candle sits on the bench where you left it last night, wax pooled along one side like frozen milk. A plank rests in the corner, measured but not yet cut, and beside it a doorboard leans waiting for hinges not yet forged. Patience lives in unfinished things. It asks no permission. It simply shares your bench. You open the shutter a crack to admit the weak dawn. The yard beyond is silvered with frost. Piles of timber wait beneath rough coverings, and curls of shavings from yesterday have stiffened in the cold. A workhorse in the neighbouring yard stamps and tosses its head, steam coming off its flanks. The whole world seems to be holding its breath before the day properly begins. There is no grand rush now. That is one of the quiet truths of the craft. Before the hammering and planing, before the shouting of delivery men, or the arrival of customers with impossible requests and exact opinions about things they have never made, there is this hour. You sweep the bench, you sort pegs by size, you test the edge on a chisel and take a whetstone to another. Long strokes, wet stone, steady hand. The rasp of metal is small and intimate in the dim light. A carpenter's patience is not the bright patience of saints painted in church glass. It is a worn, workmanlike patience. It keeps going because there is no practical alternative. As the light grows, the town stirs more fully beyond the yard. You hear a gate creak open somewhere, a woman calling to a child, the hollow clank of a bucket against a well curb. The bells sound again, softer now with distance and air between. They have followed you from bed to lane to bench, stitching the dark hours together. You think of the day ahead not in its full shape, because no medieval day reveals itself so generously, but in fragments, timber to inspect, boards to judge, tasks that will ask for waiting when you would rather force them. The first lesson of the morning is simple and old. Nothing made well begins in haste. So you stand in the workshop doorway with the chill still in your hands and the scent of oak rising around you, while dawn finally loosens over the roofs and the patient labour of the day opens like a rough wooden gate, slowly, stubbornly, and without ceremony. The light comes slowly, as though morning itself has doubts about the wisdom of getting involved. By the time the frost begins to loosen on the yard fence, you're already out among the timber stacks with your cloak drawn close and your breath whitening before you. The world smells of damp bark, cold earth, and the clean, faint bitterness of fresh-cut wood. A rook calls somewhere beyond the hedgerow, sounding like an old man objecting to the weather. In the lane behind the workshop, a cart rolls past with a groan of axles and a splash through thawing mud. All at once the day is awake, and you are standing before a pile of trunks that look, to any sensible outsider, like a great many logs and very little else. But this is where the work begins, not with cutting, not with hammering, with looking. That's the first trial. Wood asks to be watched before it is touched. oak, ash, elm, beech. Each keeps its own temper, its own little stubbornness. Oak is faithful but heavy, proud of itself, difficult in the way solid men are difficult. Ash is springier, more willing in some tasks, though no less inclined to surprise you when the grain turns sly. Elm laughs at damp and serves well where water likes to meddle, but it can be perverse under the blade. No one can quite agree whether beech is underrated or merely a long argument disguised as timber. Every carpenter has a different answer, and every answer is delivered with the confidence of prophecy. You move along the stack, laying a hand here and there on bark, on cut ends, on a board already hewn square. A trunk tells stories from its rings if you know how to listen, though not in any tidy or romantic way. The width of the growth says something of good summers and poor ones. A twist in the grain hints at wind on an exposed slope. A scar along the side may mean the tree bent around hardship and never quite forgot it. Trees, like people, carry their history into every room they enter. The inconvenience is that, unlike people, they do not explain themselves first. The yardmaster, a broad man with a nose reddened by seasons of cold mornings, appears from the shed rubbing his hands together. He gives you the sort of nod that belongs to men who have spoken daily for years without ever feeling the need to improve the arrangement with enthusiasm. "You're early." You say that every time. You tell him. "And one day I'll be wrong." This is as close as either of you gets to sentiment. He shuffles over the yard, boots crushing old shavings, and together you begin the work of judgment. There is no shortage of timber in one sense, because there are logs before you, and more promised from estates upriver. But useful timber is another matter. Straight timber. Sound timber. Timber seasoned enough not to rebel the moment it enters a warmer room. That is rarer, and everyone wants it masons for scaffolds. Wheelwrights for rims and spokes, peasants for plough handles, abbeys for stalls and screens, manors for doors stout enough to reassure their owners that the world may be poor and lawless, but at least the hinges are respectable. You stop at an oak trunk lying on skids, broad and dark and already stripped of branches. Its bark has been peeled in places, revealing the pale flesh beneath. The cut end is cool under your fingertips. You crouch, examining the rings, the heartwood, the small checks beginning at the edge. It is not enough to see that wood exists. You must see what it intends. That is the slow art. Some boards will split if urged too quickly. Some will bow in drying. Some look straight until you take them apart and discover a knot hidden exactly where your best plan required virtue. Some swear that trees felled in winter behave better, that the sap lying low in the cold leaves the wood calmer, less likely to warp, less appetized by worms. Others insist that timber cut beneath a waning moon seasons truer, because the moon, having less pull, leaves the moisture quiet in the grain. Even now, it's hard to tell whether these rules come from long habit, practical wisdom, or the medieval desire to involve the heavens in absolutely everything from childbirth to cabbage storage. Yet men follow them. A forester mutters about the right month. A carpenter glances up at the moon before ordering felling. An old widow in the town says beams raised from improperly cut wood draw bad dreams into a house. No one laughs quite as hard at her as they pretend they do. You rise and walk to the seasoning shelter, where planks lie stacked beneath a rough roof with spaces between them so air can pass. Here patience becomes visible. Timber is not merely cut and used, not if you want it to remain where you put it. A board too green is a promise of future embarrassment. Build a chest with it, and the lid may shrink into sulks. Hang a door from it, and by spring it may gape like a bad tooth. Fit boards too soon, and they will spend the next year arguing with one another in cracks and warps and little betrayals of line. The worst part is that when such failures arrive, they arrive later, with all the innocence of problems that pretend not to be your fault. You slip one plank out just enough to inspect it. Oak again, already squared, its surface rough from the saw. You sight along its length with one eye narrowed. Straight, almost. But almost is a treacherous word in this craft. Almost straight becomes noticeably crooked as soon as it frames a doorway. Almost dry becomes definitely split beside a hearth. Almost fitted becomes a customer standing in your yard with the expression of a man who has discovered that his expectations were built of fantasy, and your labour was built of wood. A boy from the sawpit arrives carrying a bundle of wedges and looking as though he's been awake since the Norman conquest. His hair stands in several directions, and one cheek bears a smear of old sawdust stuck there by sleep. He greets you with a hurried nod and disappears into the shed. Apprentices and helpers travel through these mornings like half-haunted creatures, somewhere between childhood and trade. You remember being not much different, except perhaps even colder and a little more afraid of making visible mistakes. The sawpit lies beyond the stacks, a long trench over which a log may be set for ripping into boards. When you walk over, the ground has softened enough to cling to your boots again. Mud in the yard is never fully absent, it only changes mood. The pit smells of wet soil and sap. Above it rests a trunk marked for cutting, and beside it the long saw leans like an accusation. There is a reason good boards cost what they do. Before a plank becomes a bench, a door, or the panel of a chest, someone must sweat over it in awkward positions while teeth bite slowly through grain. Medieval life has a talent for making simple objects seem deeply earned. You stand at the edge of the pit and imagine the trunk parted into usable lengths. A carpenter must think ahead in layers. This section may give stiles for a door. That one, if lucky, could serve for a chest side. Narrower cuts become rails, pegs, braces, shelves. Waste is a kind of sin in a world where labour and materials arrive hard won. Even shavings are not wholly wasted. They start fires, stuff cracks, soften a floor, or line some basket. You've seen children play with curls of fresh shaving while their mothers barter for onions. You have seen geese nose through them like aristocrats inspecting fabric. The yardmaster joins you again, scratching his beard. The miller wants that door before St. Mildred's Day. The miller wants many things. He says the old one lets in draughts. So does his conversation. The yardmaster snorts. This counts as a fine exchange. Then he points with his chin toward a stack near the back. There's ash there from upriver. Straighter than most. Costlier too. You go to see it. Ash has a paler, cleaner look than oak. Less solemn somehow, though perhaps that is unfair. It lies in length stripped and trimmed, the grain running in long, hopeful lines. You test one piece, then another. Good wood, yes. But not for everything. That is another burden of patience, refusing the pleasing board because it is wrong for the task. A handsome piece of timber can tempt you into foolishness. Every workshop has known the man who used fine, straight ash where seasoned oak should have gone, simply because the ash stood ready and the oak still needed waiting. For a while he congratulated himself on speed. A year later his work taught humility to anyone with eyes. The bells ring again from the abbey over the river, thinner now in the daylight. Their sound moves over the roofs and yards and open ground, touching stable, bakehouse, dung heap, and timber stack alike. Time in this world is not a neat progression of numbers. It is bells, hunger, weather, shadows on a wall, a candle burned halfway down, The market opening, the geese returning, the last light failing in the lane. Here in the yard, time is also wood drying by seasons. A tree that stood 30 years will not be hurried obediently into a table in 3 days. The craft asks you to accept this with grace, or at least with less muttering than yesterday. You select several boards at last and mark them with charcoal. 2 from the seasoned oak stack for the miller's door, a narrower length for cross-bracing, 1 ash piece to set aside for repairs later in the week. Then you choose a heavier timber and reject it again after a second look, noticing a hidden knot where the grain swirls like a secret. That is how it goes. Looking, choosing, doubting, choosing again. The impatient man cuts first and thinks later. The patient man spends half the morning being suspicious of timber and is mocked for caution until his work remains square in November. There is a saying, though no one knows who first spoke it, that a carpenter's eye should arrive before his hands and leave after them. It sounds wise enough to be copied by some ink-stained scribe into the margin of a monastery notebook, beside a recipe for nettle broth and a charm against toothache. Whether any scribe ever did so, no one can say. But the phrase lingers because it feels true. Your hands can shape only what your eye has understood. A woman passes the yard gate with 2 baskets hanging from a shoulder yoke, and from one basket the smell of leeks drifts in bright and sharp against the resinous air. A little later, a drover urges pigs down the lane, and the beasts object with great moral drama, as if this were the first injustice in history. Morning broadens. Sunlight, thin but honest, catches the frost lingering on the far fence and turns it briefly to silver. The dog you noticed earlier appears at the gate, sits, and watches you with unnerving concentration. It has the air of a magistrate sent to inspect your standards. By now the chosen timber is laid apart, and the rest of the stack has been covered again. Your hands are raw with cold despite the work. There is sap on one thumb, charcoal on your wrist, and a splinter lodged somewhere in the side of your palm like a private reminder from the material itself. You stand for a moment, breathing in the smell of oak and morning, hearing the faint town noises knit themselves into the day. This part of labour leaves little to show by noon. No finished object. No proud shape, only the right wood, chosen after enough waiting to save trouble later. And that is exactly why it matters. Because the craft is built as much on restraint as on action. Because choosing badly in haste means suffering slowly in public. Because wood, once cut, remembers. It remembers where the tree leaned, where the wind pressed, where water rose, where a knot tightened itself in silence for 20 years just to inconvenience you on a wet Wednesday. You cannot bully that out of it. You can only notice, adapt, and wait. So with the marked boards ready and the day properly awake around you, you gather the timber that has finally passed inspection and carry it toward the workshop bench, where measuring and marking will begin. Behind you the stacks remain, full of future arguments, future doors, future stools, future failures avoided only by patience. Ahead of you lies the yard of shavings and the long persuasion of tools. You carry the chosen boards into the workshop one by one, not because they are impossibly heavy, though oak certainly likes to remind you of its opinions, but because haste in handling timber has a way of introducing fresh problems before the older ones have even had their chance to shine. The boards come in with the smell of cold air still clinging to them, and when you set them against the bench, the room seems to gather itself around the day's real labour. Outside, the lane is fully awakened. Wheels rattle. Someone shouts for a missing goose with the raw despair usually reserved for shipwrecks and taxes. From farther off, a woman laughs, then coughs, then laughs again. But within the workshop there is another kind of morning, quieter, more deliberate, stitched together by grain, light, and the familiar rhythm of hands finding work. The shutter stands open enough now to admit a pale wash of daylight across the bench. It catches the half-burned candle from last night and lays a thin gleam along the iron square. Dust motes drift in it like lazy pilgrims who set out with excellent intentions and immediately found a place to loiter. You put your satchel down, roll your shoulders once beneath the cloak, and begin with the bench itself. A carpenter's bench is never truly clear. It is merely persuaded into temporary usefulness. You move aside a brace, a wrapped bundle of pegs, a narrow offcut saved because someday it might become exactly the thing you need, and because no honest medieval craftsman has ever looked at a piece of potentially useful wood and thought, yes, I shall throw away this future solution. The first board goes flat beneath your palms, oak, seasoned, stern, and not quite as cooperative as it looked in the yard. Of course not. Wood often behaves like a nobleman's promise respectable at first hearing, more complicated upon closer examination. You sight along its length again. The slight rise you noticed outside is still there, though in the workshop's steadier light it looks less like a flaw and more like a challenge politely clearing its throat. This is the hour of measuring, and measuring is less glorious than stories make it sound. No songs are written about a man checking width twice while squinting at a chalk line. Yet here, more than in the noisy drama of hammers and chips, patience earns its keep. You lay the square, mark a line with charcoal, shift your weight, check again, then make a finer mark with the knife. The workshop grows full of tiny sounds, the tap of wood against bench, the scrape of charcoal, the whisper of your sleeve against the board. Measured work has its own hush, almost devotional, though with fewer candles and rather more muttering. No one can quite agree whether a badly measured board is more often the result of carelessness or of invisible mischief. There are old women who say small household spirits enjoy nothing more than nudging a man's elbow when he draws a line. Others blame the evil eye, especially if a jealous rival has lately admired your work with too much warmth and not enough blinking. Some craftsmen spit lightly over a shoulder before the first marked cut of the day, not from piety exactly, but from a practical desire not to quarrel with any force, earthly or otherwise, that might prefer their joints crooked. You do not spit, because the workshop floor has enough troubles already, but you understand the instinct. The plane comes next. You run a thumb along the sole, test the iron, and set the board firm. Then the long, steady passes begin, forward, pressure, lift, return, again. Each stroke takes a little roughness and turns it to curled shaving that spill pale and fragrant onto the floor. Soon the place smells richly of cut oak, warm and dry despite the cold morning. It is a fine smell, a comforting smell, a smell that makes even hard labour feel almost civilized. The shavings gather at your boots in ribbons and curls, soft as wool to the eye, though less useful in winter wear. Planing is one of those tasks that reveals your mood to yourself. If you're impatient, the tool chatters. If you are careless, the surface tells on you. If you force the cut, the grain rebels and tears where it should have smoothed. Wood has a humiliating gift for exposing temperament. It knows when you are tired. It knows when you are annoyed. It knows when, deep in some foolish corner of the mind, you have decided to finish quickly rather than finish well. And it punishes these moods with a quiet, almost holy consistency. By the third long pass, your shoulders warm. By the sixth, your palms have forgotten the morning cold. By the 10th, the board begins to shine faintly where the plane has passed true. and the edge under your fingertips feels less like timber and more like intention. Outside, the bells ring again from the abbey, measuring the town's life in invisible portions. Within the workshop you keep another time, the time of repeated strokes and slow improvement. A peasant in the fields may reckon the day by sun and hunger. A monk reckons by prayer. A carpenter reckons by whether the board has stopped arguing. The boy from the sawpit slips into the doorway carrying a bundle of thin strips and a face arranged into neutrality, which usually means he has either broken something small or wishes not to be given something heavy. Master Hugh says these are the straightest of the offcuts. Then Master Hugh has had a generous morning, you say, taking them. The boy grins despite himself. He's missing one front tooth and has the haunted look of someone who is growing faster than his clothes can manage. His hands are reddened with cold. You notice him eyeing the curls of shaving on the floor. Take a sack and gather those as you tell him. Good for kindling, and better that than letting them swallow the doorway. He does so at once, crouching among the shavings while you continue at the bench. It is quiet, companionable work. Every workshop knows hours like this, where not much is said because words would only stand in the way of the grain. The boy scoops the curls into a sack. You plane, measure, turn the board, plane again. Dust clings to the hem of his tunic. Charcoal smudges the side of your wrist. Light strengthens across the floorboards. Once one face is true, you mark the edge, then begin on the second board. This one is for a rail, narrower and slightly less temperamental, though not enough to become smug about it. The key to the whole business is not to assume a board will continue behaving simply because it has behaved once. Many a carpenter, flushed with early success, has ruined a neat piece by treating the final passes as a formality. Wood is rarely more dangerous than when it has lulled you into confidence. At the back of the workshop hangs a cord with weighted plumb and a line dusted for snapping marks. Nearby rests an auger, a mallet, a brace of chisels, and a little wooden box containing pegs sorted by size. The pegs matter. They always matter. Great halls may gleam with painted beams and carved screens, but half the world holds together by means of humble pegs, hidden joints, and the willingness of one piece of oak to remain beside another through seasons of damp and smoke. The grander people become, the more they like to pretend buildings arise from decree. In truth, they arise from pegs, sweat, and men who know how long to wait. You lay out the frame pieces on the bench in rough order, not yet cutting final joints, only letting them sit near one another like guests at a feast who may or may not get on. Sometimes simply seeing the pieces together reveals where a plan was clever and where it was merely optimistic. A carpenter who refuses to rearrange his thinking deserves every future embarrassment. You move the narrower rail to one side, shift the style, check the line again. Better, not perfect. Better. Some swear that if a bench top is brushed with rosemary or wormwood on the first day of spring, tools stay sharper through the year. Others say the herbs merely keep vermin away and the rest is wishful thinking. Even now, it is hard to tell where remedy ends and ritual begins. In medieval life, the two walk arm in arm often enough. The same woman who sets leeches for a swelling may tuck a charm into a child's sleeve. The same clerk who calculates market tolls may wear a saint's token against fever. The same carpenter who trusts the square more than any prayer may still refuse to begin a cradle on a day whispered to be unlucky. One does not have to believe every old tale to step politely around it. By mid-morning the floor is thick with shavings. The smell in the workshop has deepened, rich and dry, mingling with the faint tallow scent from a candle newly lit in the darker rear corner. Clouds have moved across the sun outside, and the light through the shutter no longer reaches as far. The little flame wavers in the draught and throws a soft amber sheen across the tools. There is comfort in that glow, in the sense that however uncertain the weather or the customers or the road, this small pool of light exists exactly where you need it. The boy rises with his sack of shavings and lingers near the door. Will this be the miller's door? If God is merciful and the hinges arrive on time, he nods solemnly, as though hinge delivery were among the larger theological concerns of the age. To be fair, on certain days it feels that way. You begin the marking for joints, mortise and tenon, simple words for slow work. You use the knife now more than charcoal, because lines must be honest where chisels will later go. The knife leaves a crisp little track in the wood, and your thumb follows it, feeling more than seeing whether the cut sits right. Here too patience has a physical shape. It is the pause before each line, the leaning close, the refusal to assume, the willingness to spend another minute now so the joint does not mock you for a month afterward. Outside, a cart stops in the lane, and for a little while you hear a debate unfolding about sacks of barley, missing rope, and whether someone named Oswin is an idiot or merely enthusiastic. These are the village symphonies that accompany all respectable labour. A goose adds commentary. The dog from earlier appears in the doorway, sniffs once at the threshold, then wanders in as if it holds title to the premises. It circles twice among the shavings and settles near the wall with a sigh. Apparently you've gained an inspector and perhaps a partner, though one of limited practical use. You cut the first shoulder line with a fine saw, then stop. Not because something is wrong, but because the cut must begin without hurry. This is the moment everything before has led toward choosing, sighting, planing, marking, checking, and only now beginning to divide wood from wood. The saw bites softly, steadily. A faint powder gathers. The line holds. You breathe out. Good. One true cut gives courage for the next, though courage should never be mistaken for speed. Hours pass in this measured way. A board straightened, another trued, edges squared, face marks made, joint lines cut just enough to promise the next stage. The yard beyond the shutter comes and goes in brightness as clouds drift. You eat a little bread at the bench without fully stopping, the crust scattering crumbs among the shavings. The dog opens one eye, judges you, and goes back to sleep. Bells sound again. Somewhere the suspicious monk you noticed yesterday might be counting stores, or peering into a reliquary no one quite trusts. Somewhere in town a merchant is laying out cloth in the market square. Somewhere a broken cartwheel waits for future trouble. But here the day narrows to wood and line and the long patience of making each piece ready for what comes next. By the time you finally step back, flexing your fingers, the workshop floor has become a pale sea of curled shavings and dust. The boards on the bench look transformed, though no stranger would call the change dramatic. That is the secret of this stage. Much has happened, and almost nothing yet looks finished. The raw timber from morning has become ordered. It has edges, intention, preparation. It has been persuaded away from wildness and toward purpose. Not completed, no, but ready. And readiness, in a carpenter's life, is half the battle and more than half the patience. You rest your hand on the nearest board, feeling its smoothness under your palm, the hidden lines waiting for joint and fitting. Outside the town goes on with its noises, its mud, its market gossip, its bells and smoke and damp stone. Inside the workshop the air glows softly in the tallow light, and the shavings around your boots whisper when you shift your weight. The day's labour has not yet produced anything grand, only the quiet miracle of wood beginning to obey. Ahead lies the fitting of a plain oak door for a miller who believes drafts are a personal insult from the universe. For now, though, you stand in the yard of shavings and breathe in the scent of freshly planed oak, knowing that every useful thing begins like this rough, doubtful, and asked politely, over and over, to become true. By the time the light settles into its grey noon softness, the workshop has grown warmer without ever becoming truly warm, which is the medieval way of offering comfort while carefully avoiding extravagance. The tallow candle still burns in the back corner where the light does not reach, and the half-burned stub from last night remains near the bench, leaning in its little pool of hardened wax like a tired pilgrim. The dog, having decided that your workshop is a place of decent smells and limited moral outrage, sleeps among the shavings with one ear cocked toward the lane. Outside, cartwheels grumble through mud, and now and then a voice rises above the ordinary market day noise, only to sink again into the town's constant low murmur. Within this ordinary little kingdom of oak and iron, you set your attention to the miller's door. It is not a grand commission. No abbey choir screen, no carved manor chest, no heavy beam for a great hall that will one day impress visiting cousins and intimidate tax collectors. It is only a door, a plain, solid oak door for a man whose chief desire is to keep out wind, thieves, and perhaps the occasional chicken if village life takes a particularly creative turn. Yet the humblest object has its own demands. That is one of the small medieval truths no one advertises because it sounds less noble than talk of castles. A door must close, a latch must catch, a frame must not sulk in damp weather. A board must meet its neighbour without revealing daylight like a gossip reveals secrets. In the end, people do not bless a carpenter because he made something grand. They bless him because the thing works in February. You lay the stiles and rails on the bench again, this time with the real gravity of beginning. The morning's planing and marking have brought them this far, but now comes the slow persuasion of fitting, mortise and tenon, shoulder and cheek, peg and brace. Nothing dramatic, only the ancient business of convincing separate pieces of wood to live together in relative harmony. It sounds almost monastic. In practice, it involves more dust. The first mortise is chiselled with careful blows of the mallet, each strike firm but not angry. Anger rarely improves joinery. The chisel sinks, lifts, sinks again. Chips gather. Oak resists with the dignified annoyance of a man who believes he has already contributed enough. You work from both sides to avoid splintering, turning the timber, checking the line, brushing away crumbs of wood with the side of your thumb. The rhythm begins to settle into you strike, lever, clear, inspect. It is slow work, and that is exactly why it succeeds. The impatient hand blows past the line and then spends the afternoon explaining itself to a gap. No one can quite agree whether a door that sticks in wet weather is caused more by poor fitting or by offended house spirits. Some swear that if a threshold is crossed too often by quarrels, the timber begins to warp out of spite. Others insist a door first hung while a family is grieving will never shut quietly again. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, though everyone agrees on one practical point: if the door does not fit, the household will blame someone, and that someone will not be the weather, the moon, or the spirits. It will be you. Once the mortise is clean enough to satisfy both craft and conscience, you turn to the tenon. The saw bites along the shoulder line, and the little curls of dust rise pale against the bench. You keep the cut just proud, because taking more wood away is easy, and putting it back is a trick reserved for liars and saints' stories. Then comes paring with the chisel, shaving the cheek little by little, testing with fingertips, holding the piece up to the light. narrowing your eyes as if stern expression might somehow improve geometry. At the far end of the workshop, the dog lifts its head, watches you a moment, and settles again with a sigh so theatrical it belongs in the manor hall. You begin to suspect the creature has chosen you not from affection, but because sawdust offers better bedding than most of the town. Even so, a quiet witness is no bad thing during fitting. Wood can make a person feel alone with his mistakes. A dog at least suggests the universe is still populated. You test the first joint, it does not fit. Of course it does not. It goes in part way, then stops with stubborn finality, neither willing to seat nor willing to withdraw without complaint. This is the true heart of carpentry, far more than any heroic notion of craftsmanship. Not the first attempt, the second, the third, the little removal of another shaving, the turning back to the bench, the quiet admission that you and the oak are not yet in agreement. You ease the tenon back out and study the polished rub where the wood has told on itself. There. A slight fullness on one cheek, another whisper at the shoulder. You pair again, barely more than dust this time, and try once more. Better. Still not home. Again you pull it free, again adjust, again test. The bells sound faintly from the abbey over the river, marking the afternoon while you remain in conversation with a joint that refuses to be hurried. The world outside may move by prayer, trade, or hunger, but inside the workshop time is now measured by one stubborn tenon. There is bread left from the morning, and you eat a little standing at the bench, chewing thoughtfully while you examine the frame pieces like a magistrate reviewing troublesome testimony. The crust flakes onto your sleeve. The ale in the cup has gone cool. Across the lane someone begins hammering on metal, likely the smith, and the ringing carries in bright, hard notes that bounce off your quieter labour. The iron man has his own patience to practice. But at least metal glows when heated and gives clear warning when it is angry. Wood keeps its grievances private until the worst possible moment. At last the joint seats with a snugness that feels nearly like forgiveness. Not loose, not forced, just right enough that you allow yourself one long breath through the nose. There is a private satisfaction in such moments, never loud, never theatrical. No one in the town square will cheer because one mortise accepted its tenon with proper dignity. Yet this is where all the later ease of use begins. Every winter breeze kept from the miller's hall, every latch that aligns without swearing, every draught that fails to creep across his rushes in the night will owe something to this quiet, stubborn fitting done now. The second joint goes faster, which should never be confused with easy. It only means the first battle taught the terms of war. You work steadily, shoulders aching a little from the bench height, fingers coated with fine oak dust that settles into the lines of your skin. The candle flame nods in a draught each time the door opens. Once, the yardmaster appears to ask whether the hinges have come from the smith. They have not. Of course they have not. Hinges belong to that noble class of necessities that always arrive just after patience has worn thin enough to become philosophical. He said before evening, the yardmaster tells you. He said that yesterday. He says many things. So does the miller, and neither of them improves the door. The yardmaster gives a grunt that may be agreement and disappears again into the yard. You return to the frame, laying out the boards that will fill the middle. These too must be trimmed and brought into line, their edges meeting close enough to keep out weather but not so tight as to boast. Medieval life has little use for boasting in wood. It prefers survival. A door may be plain as a friar's soup bowl and still be admired if it holds fast through sleet. Some swear a sliver of hawthorn tucked above a lintel protects a house from ill luck and lightning. Others prefer iron nails blessed on a saint's day. hammered discreetly where no one sees. In truth, many homes rely on a combination of practical building and hopeful superstition, and few see any contradiction in that. A woman will ask you for a stronger bar across her back door, and then ask whether you noticed a magpie on the roof last Tuesday, because she is certain the bird means something. You tell her the bar will help more than the magpie, and she nods while remaining unconvinced. This is medieval balance oak, iron, prayer, and a pinch of folklore, all fitted together with the same determination you now bring to the miller's boards. By mid-afternoon the frame is assembled dry on the bench, not yet pegged, not yet final, but standing in its own shape. You step back and look, adore, almost. It leans there with the plain dignity of useful things, all straight lines and quiet intentions. Yet when you test it in the rough opening you have mocked up against the jam pieces, the truth announces itself immediately. It binds at the top corner. Naturally. You lower it back down, pressing your lips together. There are many tiny humiliations in honest labour, and one of them is discovering that a thing so cooperative on the bench develops personality the moment it stands upright. The top rail is true enough. The style is sound. So where is the mischief, you squat? Eye the lines. Run your fingers along the edge, then lift one side slightly and see it a faint twist. Almost nothing, but enough. Enough is all a problem ever needs. Even now, it is hard to tell whether patience is a virtue or simply the only tool that works on certain days. You could force it, trim hastily, tell yourself the hinge side will forgive the rest. That is how bad doors are born. Instead, you rest the frame back on the bench and begin again with the edge, shaving a little, checking, shaving a little more. The dog opens one eye, possibly to judge you, possibly to confirm that human beings remain committed to making the simple elaborate. The light outside turns more golden, though not warmer. Through the shutter you can see people crossing the lane with baskets, cloaks, bundles. One man leading a donkey that seems to have entered into a spiritual disagreement with forward motion. The smell of someone's evening pottage drifts in now and then, rich with leek and maybe a little bacon if fortune has lately smiled there. Hunger tugs at you, but not yet enough to stop. Work like this teaches a person that appetite is persuasive but a half-fitted door is louder. At last the trimming holds. You test the frame again in the opening. This time it clears, not by much, but by enough, and enough is a beautiful word when honestly earned. You can imagine it hung now, the miller setting his shoulder to it on windy evenings, pleased that the latch meets cleanly. You can imagine his wife laying extra rushes near the threshold and noticing fewer draughts at her ankles. You can imagine no one praising the joinery itself, which is exactly as it should be. Good work in a village often becomes invisible once it begins serving life properly. The hinges arrive at nearly the last useful hour of daylight, borne by a smith's helper whose face carries the blank innocence of a messenger, keenly aware that lateness is not his fault, and also very much his problem. The hinges are stout enough, hand-forged, a little rough at the strap ends but serviceable. You hold one against the stile, mark the places, and begin the final fitting for iron. Here patience takes on yet another shape. Wood and iron are not natural friends. They can live together beautifully, but only if introduced carefully. You cut the shallow seat for the hinge plate and test it, a little proud. There again. Better. The smell of worked oak rises sweet and dry beneath the sharper tang of forged iron. Outside the bells ring toward evening, and the sound comes softer now, wrapped in damp air and distant smoke. The workshop dims. The candle's pool of light grows warmer. The dog stands, shakes sawdust from its coat in a glittering little storm, and wanders to the doorway as if to remind you that the day, however unfinished, is moving toward its close. You set the hinge at last, then the second. The latch will wait until morning, and the hanging at the mill can wait as well. That is another lesson the craft insists upon. There are limits to what should be done in failing light. A man who pretends otherwise is usually a man who later blames darkness for decisions made by pride. So you stop where stopping is wise, not where eagerness wishes. The door rests against the bench, half complete but true enough now to trust. You stand in the fading workshop with oak dust on your sleeves, tired hands, and the faint ache in your back that comes from leaning over work that asked more of your patience than your strength. Around you lie the signs of the day shavings underfoot, knife marks on the bench, the half-burned candle, the smell of warm wood, the quiet dog waiting by the door, and the plain oak frame that has taken all afternoon to become merely correct. And in a carpenter's life, merely correct is often the closest thing to triumph. By morning, the weather has changed its mind in the least helpful way possible. When you wake, the room feels softer somehow, the cold less sharp but more insinuating, as though the air has turned from honest frost to a damp hand laid flat against every surface. The rushes underfoot hold a trace more moisture. The blanket smells faintly of wool and sleep, and the fire that never fully won the night. Outside the shutter, there is no clean silver dawn today, no bright edge of frost along the lane. Only a pale, swollen light pressing through cloud. Somewhere beyond the houses a bell sounds duller than usual, as if even bronze has become waterlogged. You sit up on the pallet and listen. No wind. That is the first sign, a stillness too thick to trust. Then, after a moment, the tiny, separate sound of droplets beginning somewhere on the eaves. Not rain in full yet, just the first scouts. The kind of weather that arrives with the expression of a man asking to stand by the fire and then proceeds to ruin the whole afternoon. You dress in the half-light, pulling on your tunic, fastening your cloak, warming your hands over coals coaxed back into a weak red life. The room smells of smoke, damp straw, and old ash. When you lift your boots, the leather feels tacky from yesterday's mud not fully dried, which is already an insult before the day has properly begun. You eat a bit of coarse bread with a strip of cheese harder than philosophy, and wash it down with cool ale. It is not a meal to inspire poetry, though perhaps poetry is wise enough to stay indoors on a day like this. At the workshop yard the sky hangs low and grey, like wet wool stretched across the whole world. The timber stacks are covered, but the coverings sag where moisture has settled in the night. Water beads on the fence rails. The lane beyond is already loosening into churned brown softness, wheel ruts returning to life with malicious enthusiasm. Rain and unfinished wood are old enemies, and the battlefield is always your patience. The miller's door stands in the workshop where you left it last evening, hinges fitted, frame true, waiting for the final work before it can be hung. In dry weather, it would feel nearly done. In weather like this, it feels like a fragile treaty with the atmosphere, one that the atmosphere has no intention of honouring. Damp air enters a board like gossip enters a village quietly, quickly, and with consequences by supper. You set the door on the bench and run your fingertips along the edges, still sound, still square, but the workshop itself has changed overnight. The boards in the wall smell darker, the bench top feels cool and faintly clammy, and the tools take on that dim shine iron gets when moisture sits near it too long. You wipe the square and the auger with an oily rag. You check the plane iron. You look toward the shutter. Outside, the first real rain begins. It comes not in a violent rush, but in a steady, resigned descent, as if the heavens have settled in for a long and unproductive conversation. Drops strike the yard, the wood coverings, the threshold, the lane. Within minutes the whole world begins speaking in water. The roof ticks, the eaves drip. Somewhere a bucket overflows with the patient satisfaction of being right all along. The dog that has taken to following you appears at the doorway, looks once at the rain with the grim understanding of a creature who has no illusions about weather, and moves inside uninvited. You cannot blame him. Rain changes the tempo of everything. Not just travel, not just trade, but thought itself. On a bright cold day, work can stride. In steady damp, it waits, listens, checks, doubts. You had meant to carry the door to the mill by midday, hang it, test the latch, and perhaps take on one or two smaller repairs before evening. Now the road to the mill will be a ribbon of sucking mud, the mill yard itself full of slurry and dripping grain sacks, and every exposed surface of the door at risk of swelling before you have even finished admiring your own efforts. So you wait. Patience in carpentry is often described as patience with wood, but that is only half the truth. You must also have patience with weather, which is less reasonable and far more theatrical. A board can be studied, a season can be anticipated. Rain does not negotiate. It simply arrives and expects your plans to apologize. You turn instead to smaller tasks inside the workshop. A latch piece needs smoothing. Pegs need trimming. The inside face of the door can take another careful pass to ensure the edges remain honest. These are useful things, but the truth is plain: today's real labor is not making progress. It is refusing to ruin progress by forcing it through damp conditions. This is harder than it sounds. Medieval life is full of people who cannot afford delay, and you are one of them. Customers want their goods. Meals depend on coin. Days of clear weather are not promised by any saint, no matter how polished the relic. Yet forcing wet work invites greater poverty later. There is no profit in fitting a swollen door that must be remade by Candlemas. Some swear that rainwater gathered from the first storm after a saint's feast is good for curing warped timber if mixed with ash and rubbed along the grain. Others say such water only belongs in poultices and silly stories. A widow in the lane claims that if you leave a shaving curl under the eaves during a long rain, and it twists inward by dawn, the weather will hold for 3 more days. If it twists outward, the sun will come. No one can quite agree whether this has ever worked. Though people continue checking their shaving curls with an earnestness normally reserved for moral judgment, medieval life often places great faith in things that cost nothing to try. By late morning, the workshop smells richly of wet air and oak. You pair the latch recess with slow, precise cuts, listening to the rain drum on the roof. It is oddly soothing at first. Then, after an hour, it begins to sound like a long lecture from a person who enjoys hearing himself speak. The dog dozes among the shavings. The half-burned candle from yesterday is joined by a fresh tallow dip, because the dark of the storm steals light from the room long before noon. In that wavering amber glow, the iron tools look older, more solemn. The bench seems a little like an altar where the only sacrament is not losing your temper. A woman from 2 houses down appears at the workshop with a stool under her arm and a hood darkened by rain. One leg has split near the joint, and she wants to know whether you can mend it quickly, if possible. Which are words customers offer with the bright innocence of those not personally acquainted with the grain. You take the stool, inspect the split, and tell her yes, but not before evening. Before supper, she asks. Before one of your future suppers, you say. She laughs, because she is used to you, and leaves with her wet hem brushing the threshold. The stool joins the growing little congregation of delayed things. In a dry week, you would mind more. Today it feels appropriate. Even furniture has decided to come apart in sympathy with the sky. You spend the next while cutting a small wedge, easing the cracked joint apart just enough to clean and set it properly. It is ordinary work, almost invisible when finished, and perhaps that is why it calms you. Small repairs keep the hands occupied when larger plans must wait. They are the pottage of craft, not glamorous, but sustaining. Outside, cartwheels struggle in the lane. You hear one pass, bog down, curse, then heave free. Somewhere a child shrieks with delight at the mud, proving that misery and entertainment are often separated only by age and responsibility. At midday you eat seated on the bench, bread and onion and little smoked fish wrapped in cloth. The rain continues. Water threads down the shutter frame. The dog opens an eye at the smell of fish, receives a modest scrap for his loyalty or shamelessness, and resumes his pose of weather-beaten dignity. You chew slowly and watch the workshop breathe around you, candle flame bending in draughts, fine dust settling, droplets gathering at the threshold where boots have carried in the world. Even now, it is hard to tell whether days like this teach patience or merely expose how little of it you possess to begin with. There is a temptation to call such weather-wasted time, yet the door before you, the mended stool, the pegs laid out by size, the tools wiped and set in order, none of these are wastes. They are the hidden part of the craft, the quiet underside. A carpenter's labour is not only in what leaves the workshop, but in what is prevented from going wrong there. By afternoon the rain deepens from steady to settled. The sky lowers further. The abbey bells come faintly through the wet air, blunted and mournful, as though wrung under water. You try the miller's door once more in the mock opening, just to reassure yourself. The fit is close but still honest. Good. Very good. Considering the day's intentions. Still, you will not risk hanging it in this damp. A door deserves a fair beginning. Not a first meeting with its frame while every board in Christendom is swelling like bread dough. The miller may complain, but the miller complains the way geese hiss frequently, and with little lasting consequence. The yardmaster steps in out of the wet, cloak dripping, beard jewelled with rain. He looks at the door, at the sky beyond the shutter, and makes the face of a man who already knows the answer to his question. Not today. Not unless you'd like it hanging crooked by vespers. He grunts. The road to the mill is nearly a pond. Then the pond can wait for tomorrow? He nods, rubs his hands over the brazier, and tells you that one of the Abbey lay brothers slipped near the granary and claims the fall happened because someone spilled blessed oil there 3 days ago and failed to say the proper prayer afterward. You consider this. Or you say, because stone becomes slippery in rain. The yardmaster shrugs. Both can be true. And that, perhaps, is the medieval answer to most things. Both can be true. The practical and the mystical, the wet stone and the forgotten prayer, the swollen board and the evil eye. You live in a world where charms hang above stable doors and also where men with sense still cover the timber before a storm. One does not cancel the other. One simply gives conversation to the rain. As the afternoon drifts toward evening, you sand the rougher places on the stool leg with a scrap of rush mat and finish the repair. You sort the remaining pegs. You rewrap a chisel handle where the binding has loosened. The candle gutters and is replaced. Smoke from the hearth climbs reluctantly, then finally commits. The workshop becomes dim and close and almost cozy. If one is willing to define cozy as not currently being rained on directly, there are worse standards. At last the day accepts what it is, a day of waiting. The kind of day that teaches you not by grand revelation but by mild, relentless refusal. The miller's door remains in the workshop, unfinished in the only way that matters now, delayed not by laziness or error, but by damp air and common sense. You stand over it one last time before closing up, palm resting flat on the oak. It feels cool, solid, patient in its own stern fashion. Wood has always known how to wait longer than men. You lower the shutter against the darkening rain, and the room narrows to candlelight, smoke, damp wool, and the soft rustle of the dog turning in the shavings. Outside, the lane has become a dark ribbon of mud under the dripping eaves. Inside, the unfinished door leans beside the bench like a lesson you did not ask for and cannot argue with. Some days the craft moves through cutting and fitting and visible progress. Some days it moves through restraint alone, and on such wet, stubborn afternoons. Patience is not a virtue shining in stained glass. It is simply the decision to leave good wood alone until the world is less soaked and foolish. The rain has passed by the next morning, though it leaves the whole town feeling as if it has slept badly. The lane outside the workshop shines with a thin skin of watery brown. The ruts deepened, the dung heaps softened, the cart tracks widened into long regrets. A pale light stretches over the roofs, not bright, but clear enough to reveal every inconvenience in generous detail. Smoke rises from chimneys in flat blue threads. The air smells of washed earth, wet hay, and wood that has spent the night thinking about moisture. Under your boots the ground gives a little, not enough to swallow you whole, but enough to remind you that medieval roads are less like roads and more like ongoing arguments between soil and ambition. Inside the workshop, the miller's door still waits against the bench, patient in the infuriating way only unfinished things can be patient. You test the edge again, because that is what weather has taught you to do. Still true, still close, good. The damp day did not undo yesterday's caution. That ought to feel like a victory, though in carpentry victories are often so modest they must be discovered by hand. A corner that has not swollen, a joint that has not opened. A line still honest in morning light, you take them as they come. Yet today is not only for the door. There are smaller commissions waiting in the shop, little repairs that gather in the corners of a craftsman's life like crumbs on a trestle. They do not sound grand, and no one sings of them, but they are the bread of the trade. A loose chest lid from a widow near the well, a stool rung split by age or by a nephew with more energy than sense, a bench whose peg has worked itself free after years of being sat upon by men who consider furniture a philosophical opponent. Little things, ordinary things, the sort of work that keeps a village from quietly falling apart one joint at a time. You begin with the chest lid. It rests on the bench with one hinge side slightly torn, and the board itself showing the mild indignity of long use. Chests do hard service in this world. They hold wool blankets, iron keys, family linens, seed grain, marriage tokens, little saints' badges, winter clothes smelling of lavender and smoke, and sometimes the sort of private letters no one admits to having. They sit at bedsides and under benches and in the corners of halls, enduring damp, mice, careless children, and generations of rough handling. A chest is not admired until it fails, which makes it a thoroughly medieval object. You lift the lid, study the split, and run your thumb along the grain. The wood has dried and loosened over time, the pins worn, the fitting shifted, nothing dramatic, just age speaking quietly. You take out the old peg, clean the hole, trim a new one, and pare the damaged section until the crack meets cleanly again. The smell rising from the fresh cut is soft and sweet, different from the stern oak of the miller's door. Gentler wood, easier to persuade, though easier wood has its own slyness. It can crumble where you hoped it would hold, and hold where you were ready to trim. The dog comes in as you work, shakes off a memory of damp from the lane, and settles by the door as if assigned there by guild law. You're beginning to suspect he has simply annexed the workshop. Fair enough. He snores with more commitment than several men you know approach their trades. As you fit the peg and ease the hinge side back into line, the bells over at the Abbey ring the morning office. Their sound arrives clean now that the rain has gone, passing over the roofs and the yard and the muddy lane beyond. Those bells have followed you from the first cold morning of this journey, and by now they feel almost like another tool in the shop, one that measures not boards but the shape of the day itself. A monk marks time with prayer. A carpenter marks it with what can be mended before the next bell. Some swear that a chest placed at the foot of the bed keeps nightmares from climbing into the blankets, especially if a sprig of dried rosemary is tucked beneath the lid. Others say the herb only keeps moths away, and the dreams are their own affair. No one can quite agree whether objects in a house absorb the temper of those who use them, yet old people often speak to furniture as if it has memory, patting a worn bench, muttering at a stuck lid, thanking a table that has outlasted 2 marriages and an outbreak of fever. Perhaps they are not wrong. A village learns to treat useful things like companions. When the chest lid is finished, it closes with a soft, satisfying certainty. Not dramatic, just right. You set it aside and pull the next task onto the bench, a 3-legged stool that ought to have remained a 3-legged stool but has ambitions toward collapse. One rung has loosened, another shows a small split, and the seat top is polished smooth by years of use and the bottoms of many patient people. Stools are the uncelebrated citizens of any medieval room. They stand by hearths, alehouse walls, market stalls, and work tables. They endure children climbing on them, old men leaning too heavily, and the occasional visitor who sits as though engaged in personal combat. This stool belongs to a woman who sells leeks and onions from a basket by the square. You know it by the faint smell embedded in the wood, sharp and earthy, as if the seat itself has opinions about root vegetables. You pull the loose rung, clean the socket, and shave a replacement shoulder so it will seat more tightly. Again the work is tiny, almost ridiculous in its scale compared with beams and doors, yet the hand must be no less careful for that. In some ways small repairs demand more patience, because there is less room for pride. No one can hide rough workmanship behind the grandeur of a big project when the whole problem is a stool the size of a sleeping dog. Outside. The town resumes itself after the weather's interruption. You hear cartwheels splashing through the softened lane, a woman calling for a child, the cry of a hawker carrying smoked fish, and farther off the hollow clatter of someone setting up for trade. The market toll booth by the gate will be busy today, collecting its little due from merchants who all believe themselves uniquely burdened by the concept. Somewhere an ink-stained scribe may already be scratching figures into a ledger, counting sacks, names, debts, and excuses. Somewhere a manor steward is checking winter stores with the look of a man who trusts no rat and few relatives. You turn the stool upside down and brace it between your knees while the new rung is set. Tap, check, turn, tap again. The little ritual of fitting has become so natural now that you scarcely name it in your own mind. Though each action still carries the same old rule, do not force what must endure. That is the lesson whether you are fitting a manor door or a market stool. Force achieves speed and then charges interest later. Even now, it is hard to tell whether villagers value this sort of work properly. They are grateful, certainly, and often urgent. But because a repaired stool or chest looks so ordinary when done, the labour disappears into usefulness. That is the fate of much honest craft. A bench that no longer wobbles becomes invisible the instant a tired man sits on it with relief. A lid that shuts cleanly is forgotten as soon as blankets are put away. You're not building monuments today. You're repairing the unnoticed skeleton of everyday life. That thought follows you as you move to the next piece. A narrow bench plank with an edge gone rough and one support slightly askew. This one comes from the alehouse, which explains both the damage and the sticky patch near one end that smells faintly of spilled ale and bad decisions. Alehouse furniture lives a hard existence. It receives more boots than prayers, more elbows than admiration, and more confessions than the priest. You scrape the old residue, square the support, replace a peg, and smooth the edge just enough to keep splinters from joining the evening conversation. Some swear that a bench in an alehouse ought to have a little iron nail hidden beneath it, blessed at Candlemas, to ward off quarrels. Others say if a bench has heard 3 lies, 7 boasts, and 1 badly sung ballad in a single night, no blessing can help it. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, but everyone agrees that alehouse furniture sees the human condition from a very low and unflattering angle. You smile to yourself as you work, the kind of quiet smile that never reaches much beyond the beard. That is the mood these small jobs bring, not triumph, not drama, just the faint warmth of usefulness. The workshop smells of shavings and old smoke. Light falls across the bench in a pale rectangle. The dog snores. The half-burned candle from the wet day sits forgotten near the wall, beside a box of pegs and a cord of twine. There is something deeply reassuring in such disorder when it belongs to a place where things are put right. At midday you carry the miller's door at last to the mill, because the weather has cleared enough and the road, though ugly, is passable. The journey is not long, but mud adds distance to everything. The lane sucks at your boots, and by the time you reach the mill yard your hems wear a fresh border of brown. The mill wheel turns slow and dark in the stream, the air full of damp grain smell, chaff, and the steady wooden complaint of machinery older than patience itself. The miller meets you with the grave urgency of a man who believes drafts are actively conspiring against him. Inside the doorway, you set the new door in place and begin the hanging. This too is mending in a sense. A door is not only a new object, it is a repair to the boundary between shelter and weather. You fit the hinge pins, check the swing, trim a whisper from one side, test again. The miller hovers nearby with folded arms, offering helpful observations of the sort that become considerably more helpful if one is deaf. It should close firmly. A revelation. Yes, you tell him. That was among my secret hopes. He blinks, uncertain whether he has been mocked. The answer, mercifully, is yes. When at last the door swings and seats properly, the latch catching with a clean wooden note, the miller gives the sort of approving grunt men reserve for work they had half expected to criticize. He opens it, closes it, opens it again, as if trying to catch it in some deception. It holds. There, he says, that's better. Of course it is. It has taken a damp day, a clear morning, and enough careful fitting to test a saint, but the satisfaction is real nonetheless. The draughts at his threshold will lessen, his wife will notice, the children may slam it within the week, because gratitude in this world is never left untested for long. Still, it is done. You return to the workshop with coin in your pouch and mud heavier on your boots. Afternoon light has begun to bend toward gold, and there is still time for one more repair. You choose the simplest of the remaining jobs, a little box with a warped lid and a tiny clasp that no longer aligns. It belongs to an elderly woman who keeps dried herbs inside it, and when you open it, the scent of thyme and something bitter rises at once. Folk cures and kitchen scents live in every medieval house. Sage for sore throats, comfrey for bruises, fennel for the belly, garlic for almost everything except dignity. You shave the lid edge, adjust the clasp, and fit it so the box closes once more with a small, private neatness. By evening the workshop has changed in that subtle way it does after a good day of the ordinary work. Fewer broken things wait in corners, more useful things stand ready to go home. The bench bears new knife marks, the floor new curls of shaving. Your hands ache, though not unpleasantly. The bells ring again, softer now. Outside the sky fades over the muddy lane, and smoke thickens above the roofs as suppers begin. You look around at the chest lid, the stool, the alehouse bench, the herb box, and the empty space where the miller's door had leaned. None of it is grand. None of it will outshine an abbey roof or a manor gate. Yet all of it matters because people live among these things. They sit on them, store hopes and onions in them, shut out the wind with them, lean tired elbows on them after market day. This is the carpenter's quiet kingdom, built not of glory but of usefulness renewed. And perhaps that is where endless patience proves itself most honestly, not in the raising of splendid structures, but in the humble, repeated act of mending the ordinary world so it can go on feeling solid beneath everyone else. The next day draws you out beyond the workshop and the market lane, past the little rhythm of stools and chest lids and ordinary village needs, toward the place where work grows heavier and the air itself seems to stand a little straighter. Word has come from the manor gate repairs are wanted, and wanted soon, which in the language of households with stone walls and inherited anxieties means someone important has noticed a practical problem and converted it into a question of dignity. So after a breakfast of coarse bread, onion, and ale that tastes faintly of the barrel more than the brew, you gather your tools and set off under a sky the colour of pewter rubbed thin at the edges. The road out of town still bears yesterday's wetness. Mud clings where carts have cut deep, and the verges are tufted with coarse grass silvered by a weak dawn frost that survived in the shade. Your boots carry the memory of the mill yard, and accept this new burden without enthusiasm. The dog, who by now has appointed himself your silent escort, trots a few paces ahead, pauses, looks back, and then continues with the air of a minor official supervising your travel arrangements. Along the roadside stand little shrines blackened by weather, one hung with a cheap pilgrim badge, another with a strip of faded cloth tied there by some hopeful hand. The bells from the abbey come faint over the fields, thinner this far out, as if the day is being marked from a great distance. The manor rises by degrees rather than all at once. First the boundary ditch, then the timber palings and the larger gatehouse beyond, dark with age and patched in places where weather has had long practice. Smoke drifts from within. You smell damp earth, horse dung, wood smoke, and somewhere the rich promise of a kitchen already at work on pottage for people far better fed than the men who keep their roofs honest. A pair of crows bicker on the outer fence like stewards disputing accounts. At the gate you are met not by the lord, of course, nor by anyone whose hands have known meaningful labour this week, but by a servant with a ring of iron keys at his belt and a face arranged into the permanent suspicion of a man entrusted with other people's thresholds. He looks at you, at the satchel, at the dog, and then back at you as though one of these items is likely to prove a moral disappointment. "You're the carpenter." And this, you say, glancing at the dog, is my senior advisor. The servant does not smile. Perhaps he has been born without the relevant hinge. He opens the gate just wide enough to admit you, which feels less like welcome and more like a temporary concession to necessity. Inside the manor yard, the ground is tamped harder than the village lanes, though no less muddy where traffic has had its way. There are sheds, a stable, a well curb worn smooth by rope, and a row of outbuildings leaning at slightly different angles as if the whole estate has spent generations trying not to notice its own repairs. The problem, it turns out, lies at the gatehouse and in a storage room just beyond the inner yard. One leaf of the outer gate drags against the threshold beam when damp rises, and a postern door near the winter storehouse has begun to sag so that the bolt no longer meets cleanly. Neither task sounds grand. Both are exactly the sort of thing that becomes urgent in a great house. Because large households depend on the illusion that everything shuts where it ought to shut and opens only when properly commanded. You stand before the gate first. It is a brute of a thing. Thick oak planks braced with diagonal members, darkened by rain and years, iron straps spread over it like black veins. Heavy enough that every flaw is magnified into a conversation. The lower edge shows wear where it has been grinding at the sill. You crouch, run a hand along the scarred oak, inspect the hinges, glance at the upper pin, then sight the post. There, a slight shift, not dramatic, but enough. That is often the manor way. Not one clean failure, but a slow accumulation of small neglects dignified by stone walls. Some swear that gates of old estates remember every hand that has barred them, and grow troublesome when a household is out of balance. Others claim a dragging gate is a warning of visitors, debt, or bad harvests. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether the warning is mystical or simply practical, because a badly kept estate usually has all three. Either way, no one here wants symbolism. They want the gate to stop scraping. The suspicious servant stays near as you unpack tools, joined now by a second man who carries himself like a steward's helper and watches your hands with the concentration of someone mentally counting what each motion ought to cost. You have met his kind before. In villages they ask whether a stool really needs a new peg. In manors they ask whether the lower hinge might not be encouraged rather than properly reset. Encourage is a dangerous word in repair. It often means do something quick, so I may pretend economy is wisdom. You set your shoulder under the gate leaf while a stable boy lifts the bar. Together you move it enough to feel the pull in the hinge. The timber groans. The iron complains. The whole structure gives off the weary sound of an old ox asked to dance. Yes, the upper hinge has worn and the post has settled a breath. Nothing for it but lifting, shimming, resetting, and trimming the lower edge where years of rubbing have made matters worse. A small empire of inconvenience. The stable boy, freckled and eager, fetches wedges while you direct him. He is far more useful than the servant with the keys, who continues to stand by as though distrust alone can make carpentry more efficient. Between the two of you, and with a good deal of heaving, you support the gate enough to take the strain off the hinge. Then comes the slow work drawing the pin, cleaning the seat, inserting a shaped packer where the wear has opened the fit, and checking the alignment again. Heavy repair demands a different patience from bench work, less delicate, more bodily. The hands still think, but the shoulders and back must join the argument. Your fingers are soon blackened with old grease and iron dust. The morning has sharpened into a brittle kind of cold, and every metal part bites with it. Behind you, somewhere in the hall, a bell sounds for a household meal not intended for you. You smell bread, broth, and perhaps roasted onions. A kitchen maid hurries across the yard carrying trenchers, her skirts lifted clear of the mud. Another servant empties old rushes from a side room, and the stale sweet smell of trampled herbs and dust rises into the air. Great houses contain the same details as little ones, only more of them, and with better opportunities for pretending otherwise. Even now, it is hard to tell whether nobles and their household truly understand how much of their peace depends on wood behaving itself. They notice when a gate drags, certainly. They notice when a chest will not close, when a stair creaks too loudly beneath a guest, when a shutter lets in weather, when a bench leg collapses beneath an uncle of consequence. But the constant hidden labour that keeps all these indignities at bay is usually treated like weather regrettable when bad, unremarked when good. At last the hinge is seated better, and you lower the gate to test it. It swings. Not perfectly yet, but cleanly enough to show promise. The stable boy grins. The suspicious servant manages not to frown harder. You trim a little from the scarred lower edge, shaving away what the years have already volunteered, then smooth it enough that damp will have less to catch. Another test. Better. Again. There it is. The gate moves with the heavy dignity proper to its station, no longer dragging like a man reluctant to attend prayers. Good, says the steward's helper, in the tone of one granting approval to gravity for continuing to function. You consider replying that this had also been your reckless ambition, but conserve your wit for more deserving company. The postern door near the winter storehouse proves trickier, because smaller things often do. It hangs in a narrow stone opening where the jamb has shifted just enough that wood and masonry now conduct a long-standing disagreement. The bolt misses its catch by the width of a stubborn thought. Grain sacks are stacked inside the room, and the smell of stored apples, dried peas, old straw, and cold stone hangs in the air. Winter storehouses are places of quiet seriousness. The whole estate's comfort is measured there in sacks, jars, smoked meat, onions braided for hanging, and barrels that everyone hopes will last longer than arithmetic suggests. A bent-backed woman overseeing the stores watches you from beside the shelves. Her eyes miss nothing. She has likely spent years defending these provisions against rats, damp, servants with hopeful appetites, and stewards whose numbers improve whenever they are too far from the actual barley. The bolt's been bad since Martinmas, she says. Then someone enjoys needless difficulty. She sniffs. Several people do. A fair answer. You inspect the door. The upper corner has sagged a little, but the real issue is the catch plate set too low now that the timber has settled in the damp season. The easier fix would be to hack away more wood and let the door slop into place like a drunk into a pew. That is often how old repairs happen, but an easy fix on a door used daily becomes next year's worst trouble. So you mark carefully, lift the latch bar free, plug one old hole, shift the plate, and then shave just enough from the sticking edge to let the timber breathe without boasting of gaps. While you work, the old storekeeper tells you in an almost conversational murmur that some swear grain keeps longer if a saint's relic has been carried once around the storehouse before the first sacks of autumn are laid in. Others prefer a chalk mark above the lintel or a little bunch of mugwort hung from a peg. No one can quite agree whether these things deter vermin, mould, or misfortune itself. Yet here, tucked behind a shelf, you do indeed spot a dried herb bundle tied with red thread. Medieval households hedge their bets in all directions. The dog lies at the threshold of the storehouse as though guarding the peas by hereditary right. From time to time he lifts his head at passing footsteps, then returns to his solemn nap. Outside, the yard continues its quiet bustle, a cart arriving with firewood, voices near the well, the thud of a split log, the rattle of iron from the smithy lean-to. Above all of it hangs the manor smell of smoke, hay, damp wool, horse, and expensive self-importance. When the postern door is finally rehung and the bolt set true, the old storekeeper tests it herself. She closes it once, slides the bar, opens it again, then repeats the motion with the measured suspicion of a woman who has seen many repairs and trusts almost none of them until they survive weather. "That will do," she says at last. From her, this is near poetry. The steward's helper produces payment only after counting it twice, which confirms everything you suspected about his soul. Still, the coin is sound enough, and the work is done. Before you leave, a younger servant presses on you a heel of coarse bread and a little cup of hot broth from the kitchen passage. Likely because someone there still remembers that men repairing doors are made of flesh, and not merely oak dust and obligation. You take both gratefully and stand by the yard wall to eat, warming your hands on the cup while crows complain overhead. The manor, for all its stiffness and keyed suspicion, is only another collection of rooms trying to hold winter at bay. It has its beeswax candles in the better chambers, its rushes on stone floors, its wool blankets aired when the weather allows, its iron keys and oak doors, its pantry worries and draughts around corners. Grandeur changes the scale of things, not their nature. A gate still sags, a bolt still misaligns, a storehouse still depends on dry wood, straight fittings, and the patient labour of people whose names rarely reach the hall. When you finally pass back out through the repaired gate, it swings behind you with a heavy, proper ease. The suspicious servant locks it and gives you a nod that is not warm but is at least less accusatory than before. Progress comes in many forms. The road home lies muddy and familiar, the abbey bells faint beyond the fields, the dog already trotting ahead as if eager to return you to your rightful kingdom of shavings and smaller truths. And as you walk away from the manor's stern walls and well-fed worries, you feel again that old lesson settling into place carpentry does not belong only to workshops and village cottages. It runs through gatehouse, pantry, stable, hall, and storeroom alike, invisible until something drags, sticks, sags, or fails. Then suddenly everyone remembers the value of patience, and someone sends for you. The manor road leaves you back in the rhythm of fields and hedges, and before another full day passes, your work pulls you onward again, this time across the river toward the abbey buildings where stone, timber, incense, and discipline all attempt to live together without open complaint. The summons comes by way of a lay brother, with wind-reddened cheeks, and a manner so apologetic that you suspect he's been sent often to ask practical men for help, in places where holiness has not improved the roofing. A beam in one of the outer monastic buildings has shifted. There is a sag in the roof line above the guest-house passage, and one of the brothers fears that another hard rain will encourage more dripping than devotion. So at dawn you shoulder your tools, whistle once for the dog, and turn your steps toward the abbey bells that have been following your days since the first cold morning. The river mist still lies low when you reach the bridge. Water moves beneath in a dark, steady current, carrying little torn reflections of the pale sky. Frost whitens the grass at the edges where the sun has not yet reached. A fisherman stands near the bank with hands tucked into his sleeves, motionless as a carved saint except for the patient cloud of his breath. Somewhere farther off, a cart groans over planks, and the abbey bells begin to ring the early office, clear and layered. Not one bell, but several voices answering one another through cold air. The sound fills the valley in a way that makes even muddy boots feel briefly ceremonial. The abbey itself rises from the mist in degrees, first the outer wall, then the gate, then the church tower and the long ranges of lower buildings set around yards and cloisters, stone damp with age, leaded roofs catching the thin morning light, a carved saint over the gate, his face weathered into stern patience. The porter lets you in after glancing at the lay brother, at your satchel, and at the dog with the expression of a man uncertain whether animals count as guests, workmen, or theological complications. Inside, the abbey world has its own texture altogether. The ground underfoot is better kept than the village lane, but no less honest about the season. The air smells of wood smoke, wet stone, old lime wash, beeswax, damp wool, and a thread of incense that seems to drift everywhere, whether invited or not. Monks move through the yard in dark habits, some brisk, some bent, all carrying that strange mixture of quiet and urgency known only to religious houses and kitchens before feast days. From an open doorway you glimpse a scribe at a desk, head bent over parchment, his fingers ink-stained despite the hour. From another comes the clatter of bowls and the smell of pottage. Even in places devoted to eternity, breakfast still needs ladling. The building in question stands off the guest-house court, not the great church itself, but a timbered range used for stores and sleeping chambers above a covered passage. The roofline sags just enough to trouble anyone with eyes, which in a monastery is unfortunately quite a few people. The lay brother leads you into the passage, where cold stone underfoot meets timber overhead darkened by years of smoke, damp and weather. He points upward. "They're near the tie-beam." You stand back and look. A carpenter's first duty in such a place is to distrust all initial impressions. The sag may be from one beam, or three, or from the wall plate settling, or from a repair done 20 years ago by a man who believed straight enough was a spiritual principle. You narrow your eyes, follow the line from one post to the next, then step outside again to view the roof from the yard. The dog sits near a drain spout and watches with grave interest, as though considering entry into the monastic life if the accommodations improve. Some swear that monastery timbers last longer because they hear more prayer than tavern beams do. Others insist monks merely have better roof coverings and fewer drunken relatives falling against the posts. No one can quite agree whether sanctity enters wood through incense smoke, but there are plenty who behave as though it might. One elderly woman in the village told you once that abbey doors creak more softly because the saints dislike unnecessary noise. You did not argue. It seemed rude to challenge either her or the saints at once. A monk joins you then, a thin man with a scholar's shoulders and the practical hands of someone who has spent enough time carrying sacks to prevent complete uselessness. His face is curious rather than suspicious, which is refreshing after the manner. "Brother Anselm," he says, inclining his head, "I help keep the guest-house accounts, and, on unhappy days, the roof." Then we're colleagues in sorrow, you tell him. To your relief he smiles. Together you fetch a ladder and bring it beneath the passage roof. Climbing into old timber always changes the day's mood. Work at the bench is measured and grounded. Work overhead makes the body aware of every inch of itself, every shift of weight, every complaint in the shoulders. As you rise rung by rung, the smells grow richer: aged oak, dust, old straw from somewhere above, a faint birdy dryness, and that monastic mixture of cold stone and candle smoke lingering from below. Up near the beams, light comes through small openings in pale shafts that reveal drifting dust, and the fine threads of cobwebs hung like forgotten embroidery. The trouble shows itself more clearly from above. One principal member remains sound, though stained from an old leak, but the brace meeting it has shrunk slightly at the joint, and a peg has loosened. Near the wall plate, one end sits a little lower where the bedding has compressed. Nothing catastrophic, nothing theatrical, just the sort of slow movement that, left untended, becomes next winter's more expensive prayer request. You crouch in the cramped space, testing the timber with hand and eye. The wood is older than anything in your workshop yard, dark and almost black in places, hard as conviction. You tap near the joint, listen, feel for softness where wet may have eaten in. Still good, that is the blessing. A bad beam in a high roof can sour a man's whole week. A loosened brace and settled seat are trouble enough, but they still belong to the realm of remedy rather than disaster. Patience breathes a little easier. Below, the monks pass in and out of the passage, their voices subdued. From the church nearby comes the faint rise and fall of chanting, a woven sound, distant but steady. It threads up through the timbers and dust in a way that makes the roof space feel both holy and deeply inconvenient, which is perhaps the most medieval combination imaginable. Nothing in this world, not even a monastery, is exempt from sagging joinery. You call down for wedges, a mallet, fresh pegs, and the shorter auger. Brother Anselm brings them with surprising competence. He climbs part way and hands them up one by one, careful not to jostle the ladder. The dog remains below, posted at the foot like a furry lay assistant. There are worse crews. Even now, it is hard to tell whether roofwork teaches patience more than any other kind, but it certainly teaches humility. You cannot stride here. You kneel, balance, reach, retreat, think. Every action must be smaller and more exact because the space itself refuses drama. You ease a wedge where the settled end needs lifting, then tap it gradually. Another beneath the brace. Watch the line. Tap again. Stop. Listen. The whole roof seems to breathe around the change, not audibly, but in that quiet way old structures have of informing you that they were here before your opinion and will remain after it. This is one reason carpenters grow respectful with age. Buildings correct vanity without raising their voices. Brother Anselm, from below, asks whether the beam is bad. Not bad, you answer, only tired of being ignored. A condition familiar in religious houses. That earns another smile from you. Suspicious monks exist, certainly. You have met one already in other corners of this wandering life, but this one carries enough dryness in him to qualify as good company. When the brace is lifted enough, you draw the old peg. It comes reluctantly, worn smooth in places, swollen in others, holding the memory of decades of weather. You show it to the monk. See it has done its duty. He turns it in his fingers like a relic, though perhaps a less glamorous one. Will the new peg last as long? Not if people keep letting roofs leak over it. That is the thing about carpentry. In large places, the repair itself is only half the cure. Someone must later keep water from entering, snow from lying too long, gutters from clogging, flashing from opening, birds from treating the eaves as a public hostel. Timber is loyal, but it resents neglect. You bore the new hole clean, shave the fresh peg slightly tapered, and set it. Tap. Test. Tap again until the fit is tight and honest. Then you trim the head. The small sound of the mallet against oak disappears almost at once into the great stone hush of the abbey. No louder than a modest thought. You reset the bedding at the wall plate with thin shims cut on the spot, each one eased in and checked with more patience than anyone on the ground would ever imagine necessary. Yet necessity here is invisible. That is the rule. If you do this properly, all anyone below will notice is that the drip stops and the line looks calmer from the yard. Some swear that beams in guest houses ought to be marked discreetly with a cross in charcoal after repair, to invite blessing on future travellers. Others say it is enough to set them right and leave holiness to the clergy. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. Still, when Brother Anselm, after the joint is secure, touches 2 fingers lightly to the timber and murmurs something too soft for you to catch, you do not interrupt. A repaired roof may as well enjoy every advantage. Hours pass up there in a kind of elevated stillness. Dust gathers in your sleeves, your knees complain. The old ache in the back of your neck begins its sermon. More than once you have to pause, not for the wood's sake, but because your own body has reached the point where impatience would make a fool of you. You sit back on a beam and breathe, listening to the distant chant below shift into silence, and then later into footsteps and the clink of vessels. Somewhere in the abbey kitchen, no doubt. Coarse bread is being cut, smoked fish portioned, ale drawn, pottage stirred. Holiness runs on meals as much as on bells. At midday Brother Anselm brings you a trencher with bread, a wedge of cheese and a little onion, which you eat sitting in the roof space with your legs braced and the abbey yard below you. Light has strengthened now, pale gold on stone. The lead roof beyond glows dull and cold. A pair of crows hop along a ridge as if reviewing the property. From here you see the cloister walk, a strip of herb garden, and one novice hurrying with an armful of firewood while trying not to look as though he is hurrying. Monasteries, like manors, like villages, depend on endless ordinary labour performed under different names. By afternoon the line is true enough again to satisfy both eye and craft. You climb down, stiff and dusty, and step into the yard to look up from below. Yes, better. The sag has eased, not vanished entirely, because old buildings keep their histories, but steadied, reassured, the sort of improvement that prevents future trouble without pretending the past never happened. Brother Anselm stands beside you with his hands tucked into his sleeves. It looks less worried. That you say is all most roofs can ask. He laughs softly. Then, because monks remain monks, he asks whether there is anything else they should do. You tell him to check the covering above that line before the next hard rain, to clear the guttering, and to watch for fresh movement after winter's deepest freeze. He nods with the seriousness of a man accepting tactical instruction in a war against weather, which, in fairness, he is. Before you leave, the cellarer presses a small payment on you and an extra loaf besides. The porter at the gate has thawed enough to nod politely. The dog emerges from wherever abbey dogs perhaps go to contemplate existence and falls into step beside you. Behind, the bells ring again, richer now in the afternoon air, and the sound follows you out over the bridge and into the open fields. You carry with you the smell of old beams, beeswax and cold stone, and the peculiar peace that comes from having put right a thing most people will never notice unless it fails. Up in the dark roof space above the guest-house passage, a brace sits tighter, a peg holds firm, a line rests easier against the sky. The monks will go on chanting beneath it, travellers will sleep under it, rain will strike above it, and no one will think much of the patient labour hidden over their heads, which is, perhaps, the highest compliment the craft can receive. The abbey's bells still seem to follow you the next morning, though by now they mingle with another music entirely, the creak of waggon axles, the thump of crates, the cawing of crows over the refuse mound near the gate, and the rising human murmur that means market day has come again. You wake before full light to the familiar scratch in the rafters, the smell of old smoke and damp rushes, and that brief foolish hope that perhaps today will be simple. It is a hope best enjoyed while half asleep. By the time your boots meet the floor, Reality has already begun clearing its throat. A pale dawn hangs over the town, and the lane outside is alive earlier than usual. Merchants have come in while the sky was still iron grey, bringing cloth, smoked fish, onions, rope, little iron tools, and whatever else can be bounced over medieval roads without immediately becoming an allegory for suffering. You pull on your wool tunic, shrug into your cloak, and warm your hands for a moment above a grudging flame coaxed from last night's embers. Breakfast is coarse bread softened in ale. With a little cheese and the last of an onion, it is not festive, but that hardly matters. On market day the excitement belongs to other people. For you, it belongs mostly to lifting, carrying, negotiating, and discovering that every customer has developed a highly personal theory about woodworking. The workshop smells of oak dust and old effort when you step inside. Against the wall stand several pieces ready to go out: the repaired stool for the leek cellar, the alehouse bench, the chest lid, the herb box, and two newer items finished the evening before a narrow settling board and a small three-legged milking stool, plain as winter conversation, but solid enough to survive it. Nothing in the room is magnificent, everything in it. If fortune smiles and customers behave like reasonable mammals as might earn coin. The dog is waiting by the doorway as though he has been appointed to the commercial arm of your operation. He stretches, yawns, and gives you the look of a creature prepared to witness human folly at close range. A sensible attitude. You begin loading the cart. It is not your best cart. Your best cart, in the way of medieval possessions, exists mostly as a category of optimism. This one lists slightly to the left, complains underweight, and has one wheel whose expression suggests it is considering retirement without notice. Still, it moves, and so do you. Straw is laid down first to cushion the pieces, then boards, then the stool and bench tied into place with cord. The herb box goes into the satchel for safety, because one loose turnover market stones and that clasp will become a philosophical question. By the time you roll toward the square, the town has fully awakened. Women with baskets hurry past. A butcher's boy trots by carrying something wrapped in cloth that drips optimism from no point of view whatsoever. A man from upriver leads a donkey so burdened with sacks it looks spiritually offended. The gate toll clerk is already installed near the entrance to the square with his writing tablet and his face of patient disapproval, as if commerce itself is a bad habit the town has never quite broken. The market square unfolds in layers of sound and smell. Fresh bread from the baker's stall, sharp as blessing, wet wool steaming slightly where cloaks dry in the weak sun, fish, onions, horse dung, hot pottage, damp wood, tallow smoke, and crushed herbs underfoot. The church tower looks down over all of it with the grave expression of someone forced to host a family reunion. Stalls are being raised. Trews and tunics of all colours move through the crowd. A woman argues over eggs before the hens in question have stopped protesting their involvement. Somewhere a piper attempts cheerfulness, which in the cold air sounds like a goose being persuaded to celebrate. You guide the cart into a space near the edge of the square where small household goods and practical wares tend to gather. The cooper is already there with barrels, looking smug in the way only a man with round objects can look smug. Beside him, a tinker lays out pots and pans repaired so many times they resemble family history. Across from you, a seller of pilgrim badges arranges little pewter saints in neat rows, each promising spiritual prestige for a price modest enough to tempt both devotion and vanity. Some swear market day invites bad luck if you praise your own goods before the first customer touches them. Others say the true danger lies in letting a priest haggle, because you may lose both coin and the moral argument at once. No one can quite agree which omen matters most, but many merchants still mutter a prayer or tuck a charm into the stall cloth before business begins. You notice a bit of rowan tied beneath the cooper's cart, and the tinker has marked a tiny cross in chalk on one panhandle. Medieval commerce rarely travels without insurance from heaven. You set your pieces out with as much dignity as plain furniture can muster. The stool nearest the front, the bench behind, the settling board propped where the grain catches a little of the morning light, the repaired chest lid you keep lower, ready for its owner to collect. A carpenter at market must practice patience in a form wholly distinct from carpentry itself. In the workshop, wood resists. In the square, people do. The first to arrive is the leek seller, stout and wrapped in enough wool to qualify as a mobile wall hanging. She inspects her stool by pressing a hand on the seat, turning it upside down, peering at the rung repair, then sitting upon it with the solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence. She says, "This sound contains 3 generations of marketplace theatre." Well, you ask. It no longer tries to murder me. A glowing review. She snorts and produces payment from somewhere inside her cloak, a place evidently warmer and more secure than most manor coffers. Then she leans closer and says, "If Maud from the South Lane asks, tell her stool would have lasted longer if her boys climbed less and thought more." A dangerous request. She may accuse me of honesty. The leek seller departs with her mended stool balanced against her hip, already preparing a future conversation in which this repair will be both insufficiently cheap and surprisingly excellent. Such is the proper life cycle of market praise. Soon after comes the alehouse keeper to claim his bench. He's red-cheeked from morning exertion, and already smells faintly of yesterday's ale, which suggests either hard work or impressive continuity. He thumps the bench once, tests the repaired support with a boot, and nods approvingly. Good, 2 men can argue on that again. 3, if one is light and the other 2 are sinners. Then it will do for my regulars. He pays in coin, and a promise of a cup later if you pass the alehouse by dusk. You accept the coin as certain and the cup as pleasantly fictional, until proven otherwise. As the morning thickens, the real business begins, not collections, but customers who want new work and believe you can read both their minds and their purses. A woman with a fur-lined hood runs gloved fingers over the small milking stool and asks whether it can be just a little lower without ceasing to be a stool. A man examining the settling board tells you it is handsome, then immediately asks whether you might reduce the price since he has noticed a knot in the side. Yes, you tell him. That is where the tree wickedly insisted on having once been alive. He blinks, perhaps unsure if sarcasm is included in the cost. Market bargaining often resembles a parish dispute conducted through furniture. Everyone knows the steps. Admire, doubt, compare unfavourably to a fictional cheaper alternative, invoke family hardship, weather, or your cousin's alleged skill with tools, pause, sigh, return. A carpenter's patience here is not in shaping wood, but in not striking anyone with it. Even now, it is hard to tell which takes longer, making a thing or explaining to someone why the thing costs what it does. A stool is not merely 3 legs and a seat. It is seasoned wood, planed smooth, joined properly, balanced, so it does not wobble under ordinary use or extraordinary children, and finished by hands that have already spent half their life learning how not to do it badly. Yet in the square you must discuss it as if its final price arose from whim, and not from oak, iron, time, weather, and the constant possibility of failure. The church bell rings over the square, marking the hour as merchants, villagers, housewives, and labourers move like currents around one another. A boy runs past carrying coarse bread. A peddler from another town displays little mirrors and combs, each item promising that life might improve if only one's hair behaved differently. Nearby, smoked fish hangs from a stall beam beside strings of onions and little bundles of herbs said to keep away fever, envy, and mice. Though perhaps not simultaneously. A monk from the abbey passes through with a basket of wax candles, serene amid bargaining, which is proof either of spiritual training or impaired hearing. Then comes the kind of customer every market breeds the impossible one. He is a cloth merchant from somewhere westward, dressed better than most and eager to prove it, with rings on 2 fingers and a mouth permanently half prepared to object. He pauses before the settling board and taps it with a nail. This board is narrower than I expected. Then your expectations are generous. He does not laugh. I need one for my wife's chamber. Stouter, finer, something with more. Presence. Presence is extra. Again, no smile, a trying man. He begins describing a chest bench seat table hybrid that would, if built exactly to his spoken vision, be too heavy for any servant to move and too costly for him to buy without first becoming briefly humble. You listen, because this too is part of the work hearing people dream in wood. He wants carved edges, a hinged lid, room for blankets, and some little decorative touches while also wishing it done quickly and not too dearly. Naturally. You let him finish. What you want, you say at last, is possible. What you want quickly and cheaply is a tale. He frowns, but not in disagreement. That is the advantage of honesty delivered calmly. It wounds pride less than confusion does. You discuss dimensions, timber, hinges, delivery. He winces at the cost. You lower it by a sliver. He raises objections about timing. You explain, with the patience of a monk illuminating a manuscript for cattle, that seasoned oak does not hurry because his wife has developed decorative feelings. In the end, he gives a reluctant nod and agrees to come by the workshop in 3 days to confirm the commission. It is not a triumph, but it is work. Some swear that if the first serious bargain of market day ends with both parties faintly annoyed, the day will be prosperous. Others say true prosperity begins only when someone pays without a speech. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, and perhaps that is just as well, because the second version has almost never happened. By noon the square is full. Sunlight has come weakly through the cloud, enough to pick out colouring cloaks and make the puddles shine between the cobbles. You eat standing beside the cart bread, cheese, and a cup of hot pottage bought from a woman whose ladle moves with military authority. The dog receives a scrap and accepts it with the dignified gratitude of a saint accepting alms. Around you the market swells and shifts. A pair of nuns examines candles at the wax seller's stall. Children chase one another around a pile of wool bales until shouted back into civilization. A drover argues over tolls with a clerk by the gate. The whole town feels briefly like the centre of the world, though by evening it will go back to being muddy and draughty and entirely itself. In the afternoon a farmer from beyond the fields comes to ask about a new yoke pin. Then, seeing the small milking stool, buys it for his daughter after all. A young servant from the manor eyes the herb box, decides it is too fine for her purse, then returns later with counted coins and buys it anyway, likely for a mother or sister. This settling board goes at last to a baker's widow who wants it by her wall near the hearth. She pays without haggling much, which nearly startles you into religious gratitude. But the market also takes its due in smaller torments. A woman asks whether you can make a chest by tomorrow, only a simple one, which is like asking whether a priest can perform Easter in half an hour if one keeps the hymns brisk. A man sits on the only unsold stool, declares it comfortable, and wanders off without buying it. Another customer insists he has seen better workmanship in a town you know for a fact once produced a table so warped it nearly qualified as landscape. Through all of it, you keep your temper banked, because public annoyance earns little and attracts worse. The bells ring again later in the day, their sound drifting over the square as the first merchants begin quietly calculating whether to pack early. Shadows lengthen, smoke thickens from cook fires. The smell of trampled rushes from the church porch mingles with horse sweat and frying onions from a nearby pan. Your stock has thinned. The cart, though not empty, carries less disappointment than it did at dawn. Coin rests heavier in the pouch at your belt. You begin tying down what remains. The cooper is already gone. The tinker is folding his cloth. The pilgrim badge seller counts his little saints with the look of a man weighing both profit and salvation. Across the square, 2 servants lift baskets of bread onto a cart for the manor, while near the gate a woman wraps fur-lined cloaks against the cooling air. The town settles from bustle toward evening. As you take a last look over the square, you feel the peculiar weariness market day brings. Not the deep bodily ache of lifting beams or climbing roofs, but a thinner, more frayed tiredness from bargaining, smiling, listening, explaining, and enduring the inventive expectations of human beings who have never spent a damp week waiting for wood to behave. Yet this too belongs to the craft. A carpenter does not merely make things, he must offer them to the world, and the world, being the world, always has comments. You start the cart home through the muddy lane as the last light softens around the church tower. The dog trots beside the wheel. Behind you the market square continues to murmur, less loudly now, under bells, smoke, and the fading call of traders making their final sales. Ahead lies the workshop, the bench, the half-burned candle, and the next day's labour already gathering its shape in your mind. And so you leave market day with coin earned, patience tested, and the old lesson confirmed again: wood is not the only stubborn material a carpenter must work with. People, on market day especially, require just as much shaping, only they are far less likely to admit it. The colder mornings arrive without fanfare, which is the medieval way of introducing hardship. No announcement, just a world that grows harder at the edges while you're busy doing other things. You notice it first when your breath hangs thicker in the workshop and the water in the bucket near the door carries a skim of ice fragile as eggshell. Then in the feel of the tools, iron biting your palm through the first touch, then in the silence outside before dawn, when even the dogs seem less eager to argue with the dark. By the time this day begins, winter has not fully claimed the town, but it has sent enough advance men to make its intentions plain. You wake with your nose cold and one hand tucked beneath the blanket like a hoarded treasure. The room smells of old smoke, wool, damp straw, and the faint medicinal bitterness of herbs someone hung near the rafters weeks ago, in the hope of keeping sickness at a respectful distance. Some swear dried sage and rosemary in the house help turn away winter fevers. Others say the true cure is thicker walls, better firewood, and luck. No one can quite agree. Though nearly everyone keeps the herbs anyway. In a season like this, people take comfort where they can find it. Getting up is an act of character rather than desire. The floor is cold through your stockings, and the rushes feel brittle underfoot. The half-burned candle on the stool near the hearth has slumped into a pale frozen shape overnight. You coax embers into flame with careful breaths, and the smoke climbs reluctantly into soot-black rafters before finally consenting to become useful. It is not much warmth at first, only the thought of warmth. But thoughts, on winter mornings, are a respectable beginning. Breakfast is hot only by medieval generosity, A little pottage thickened from yesterday's oats, a heel of coarse bread, and ale gone cool in the jug. You eat standing near the fire because sitting would tempt you to linger, and lingering would lead to philosophy, which has very little practical value when hinges need fitting. Outside the Abbey bell sounds through the frosted air, clear and hollow, as though the metal itself has turned thinner in the cold. It has been marking your days from the beginning of this long patient life, and now it seems to ring over a quieter world. At the workshop the dog is waiting, curled tight against the threshold in a shape of self-preservation and mild reproach. He rises when he sees you, stretches with the gravity of an old monk, and follows you in. Inside. The air is sharper than outside somehow, because indoors the cold has settled and waited in the wood. The bench feels like stone. The tools have the stern look of companions not yet ready for conversation. Today's work is iron and wood together, which in winter means twice the stubbornness. A pair of hinges waits from the smithy for a narrow interior door commissioned by a household near the North Lane, and there are also 2 shutter fittings to replace in a cottage where wind has lately made itself far too welcome. These are not dramatic jobs, but winter reveals the dignity of small fittings. In summer a poorly aligned hinge is an annoyance. In the cold months it becomes a draught, a slam, a gap, a misery, a family complaint repeated for weeks. A shutter that does not seat cleanly is no longer merely ugly. It is the reason smoke eddies badly, or frost forms on the inside wall by dawn. You lay the new hinges on the bench and they clink against the wood with that dry iron note which always sounds slightly judgmental. The smith has done decent work. The straps are rough but solid, the knuckles true enough, the pins stout. Yet iron from the forge and wood from the yard must still be introduced like wary strangers at a feast. Left to themselves, each believes the other should adapt. You set the narrow doorboard on trestles and begin marking for the hinge seats. The grain is close and straight, a blessing. Your fingers, less so. Even inside the workshop they remain stiff from the walk, and the knife handle feels awkward in the first minutes, as though your own hand no longer quite belongs to you. This is one of winter's quiet cruelties. It does not always make work impossible. It merely makes every small motion less willing. Even now, it is hard to tell whether patience in winter belongs more to the mind or the body. The mind says measure carefully, pare slowly, test twice. The body says it would rather be near the fire with soup and no ambitions whatsoever. Between these 2 opinions your day must somehow proceed. You cut the first shallow recess for the hinge plate. A little too proud. Pare again. Better. The chisel takes crisp slices, and the smell of fresh wood rises pale and clean in the cold room. From outside comes the creak of a cart axle sounding almost musical in the frozen lane, followed by the brief sharp call of someone discovering ice where he had hoped for ground. Winter turns every road into a small morality play. The hinge settles at last with a satisfying neatness. You test the alignment against the frame piece, mark the pin position, and drill the pilot holes with the auger. The iron screws of the later centuries do not yet come to save anyone. Here there are pins, nails, straps, and the ancient rule that if one hole is wrong, every hole after it becomes a sermon on consequences. So you work slowly, warming your fingers now and then over the brazier, flexing them until feeling returns in honest degrees. Some swear iron fitted on the first clear morning after a frost lasts longer, because the cold makes both wood and metal tell the truth. Others prefer to avoid winter fittings entirely, claiming that what seats well in the chill will complain by spring. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, and in fairness both sides have evidence. Wood swells, shrinks, sulks, and remembers. Iron holds its form but grows less forgiving to the touch. A carpenter in winter becomes less a master than a negotiator. By mid-morning the first door is hung in its temporary frame for testing. It swings, but not sweetly. The lower edge kisses the threshold too intimately, then catches, naturally. You lift it, study the line, find the faint mischief, shave the underside with the plane, and try again. Better. Still a whisper of drag. Again. This time the swing is right, not loose, not proud, simply obedient. The latch will go later. For a moment you rest your palm against the wood and feel the cold stored in it. This door will stand between a family and a draft all winter. That is no small office. The customer from North Lane arrives sooner than expected, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak and carrying the expression of a woman who has spent 3 mornings reminding children not to slam the old door. She steps into the workshop, stamps frost from her shoes, and immediately goes to the fire with the deep instinct of every reasonable soul. Is it ready? It is behaving, you say, which is the next best thing. She laughs into her gloves and comes to inspect the piece. Her house, you know, is narrow and smoke-dark, with a loft above and a stair that creaks like a guilty conscience. The interior door she's ordered is not grand, only necessary to keep the little sleeping space warmer at night and a little quieter when the younger boys still quarrel by the hearth below. Winter magnifies the importance of partitions. A bit of wood in the right place can feel like mercy. She pays half now and promises the rest when the door is hung by afternoon. Reasonable terms, almost suspiciously reasonable, after weeks of market haggling. Such calm nearly counts as a miracle. Once she leaves, you turn to the shutter fittings. These are smaller iron pieces, but in some ways more troublesome. Shutters must open easily enough in daylight and close tight against the evening cold, and every cottage wall seems to lean at its own preferred angle. The 2 old fittings lie on the bench, twisted and worn from years of use. One hinge pin is bent. The catch plate is shiny where it has been struck again and again by misalignment. A humble history of drafts and repeated irritation. You carry the tools and new fittings out to the cottage near the north edge of town just before noon. The sky is pale, the light thin as watered milk, and the air has that still, bright cold which makes every distant sound sharper. You pass roadside shrines frosted at the base, and from one chimney comes the scent of leeks and bacon that nearly persuades you to abandon honest labour for theft. The dog trots beside you, occasionally nosing the verge where frost has crusted the grass. At the cottage, the woman who owns it lets you in with profuse thanks and the sort of apology people make when poverty has left visible marks on their walls. The room is small, with soot-dark rafters, wool blankets folded on a bench, a cradle near the hearth, and bunches of garlic and herbs hanging by the chimney. The shutter in question is on the windward side, and when she closes it, you see at once the problem the hinge sits low. The wood has worn around the old strap, and the catch must be lifted by hand like a reluctant child. The baby in the cradle wakes as you begin work and regards you with solemn distrust. A little boy sits on the floor pushing a carved scrap of wood back and forth as if it were a cart. The whole room smells of smoke, warm pottage, damp wool, and winter apples stored in a basket near the wall. This, more than manor gatehouses or abbey passages, is where your fittings matter most plainly. A good shutter here means better sleep, less cold on the bed, less rattling in the wind. Fewer mornings beginning with curses aimed at the weather. You remove the old iron, cut back the damaged seating, and fit a fresh block where the wood has worn too far to trust. Then you set the new hinge, The iron is freezing to handle, and twice you pause to blow warmth into your fingers. The woman, seeing this, presses a cup of hot broth into your hand without ceremony. It tastes of onions and something smoky and thin, and in the middle of the day it feels finer than feast wine. Some swear shutters should be marked with a small cross on the inside before the deepest winter nights, to keep out ill winds and things less easy to name. Others tuck dried rue or rowan above the window, especially if a child sleeps near it. No one can quite agree whether the wind carries sickness, spirits, or simply more wind. But people close up their homes against all three with equal seriousness. When the hinge is fixed, you test the shutter. It swings in cleanly. Good. You set the catch plate next, adjusting the angle little by little until it meets properly. The little boy watches as though witnessing magic, which is flattering and dangerous. Craft looks simple only when done well. He will no doubt go outside later and hammer at a box until his mother learns a new form of patience. By the time you leave the cottage, the day has begun its slow tilt toward afternoon. Frost lingers still in the shadowed lane, while everywhere the sun has touched, mud has returned in resigned patches. Winter never misses a chance to give you both problems in one day. At the North Lane house, you hang the interior door at last. The frame is a little out, naturally, because no wall in town has ever met another honestly. But you fit it true enough, trim the latch, and test the swing. It closes with a firm wooden note and holds the smaller room warmly behind it. The woman who commissioned it stands on the stair and runs a hand over the smooth edge. "That will keep the loft kinder," she says quietly. Kinder, it is not the word a steward would use, nor a merchant, nor a monk, but it may be the best word any of them could choose. Much of carpentry in winter is exactly that, persuading wood and iron to make life a little kinder. You step back out into the late light with the coin in your pouch and cold settling again through the town. Smoke lies low over the roofs. Somewhere a smith strikes iron in measured blows. Somewhere monastery bells answer the hour. The dog walks beside you through the lane, and your hands ache with that deep winter soreness made of cold, effort, and repeated precise motion. It is not misery, not exactly. It is the body's way of recording honest labour. At the workshop you clean the tools carefully before dusk. Winter is unforgiving to neglected iron. You oil the hinges left over, wrap the chisel heads, hang the plane clear of the damp floor. The half-burned candle is lit once more, and its little flame pools amber over the bench while outside the day drains away into blue-grey shadow. The room smells of warm tallow, oak dust, and the faint lingering tang of iron. You sit for a moment at last, hands stretched toward the brazier, and listen to the small noises around you, the candle sputter, the dog shifting in the shavings, the distant bell, the muted town settling into evening. Winter has made every fitting slower, every measurement colder, every piece of iron more abrupt, every board more opinionated. Yet the door is hung, the shutter closes, the latch meets, and somewhere tonight a family will sleep with a little less draught at their backs. That is the quiet reward of cold weather work. Not glory, not even comfort, most days. Only the knowledge that your patience has entered other people's walls and windows and will hold there, invisible, while frost whitens the world outside. The deep cold does not hold, it rarely does for long. Instead, after those brittle hinge-fitting mornings, the weather loosens again into a grey, damp day that seems built entirely from mud, wheel ruts, and disappointed intentions. You wake to a sky that has not yet decided whether to rain, but has clearly ruled out beauty. The room smells of old smoke and wool blankets and the little medicinal bitterness of herbs drying by the hearth. Your boots, set near the fire overnight in hopes of improvement, remain stubbornly damp at the seams. They have taken on that permanent medieval condition of being neither dry nor fully wet, only resigned. Today had meant to be a workshop day, a day of measured cuts, a little quiet joinery. Perhaps the first proper planning for the cloth merchant's overambitious chest bench seat contraption. But the world, as usual, has been consulting other plans. You're halfway through breakfast coarse bread, a little cheese, and ale with all the warmth of a personal slight when someone bangs at the door hard enough to startle the dog awake from beneath the bench. Outside stands a cartman from the Western Road, mud up to his knees and irritation shining from him like rain from a roof. One of the wagons bringing sacks of barley and a bundle of rough wool toward the square has broken an axle cap and thrown a wheel badly out of true near the roadside shrine beyond the fields. The cart cannot go forward. It can barely stand still without looking offended. The driver wants help at once, because drivers always do. And because a stranded cart in winter mud becomes the centre of a very specific kind of misery, so your careful day folds itself up and disappears. You gather tools fit for rough repair hammer, wedges, auger, spare pegs, mallet, short saw, adze, and the length of ash you'd been saving for later work. Ash is good for many things, and especially useful when a road has begun ruining someone's afternoon. The dog follows without needing invitation. He seems to understand by now that wherever there is human inconvenience, there will soon be interesting smells, and likely an opportunity to judge people silently. The road west out of town is a long strip of softened earth, rutted by cartwheels and hooves, edged with frost-bitten grass and low hedges black with damp. The sky hangs low and pale over the fields. Crows move in the distance, hopping among stubble like little black clerks inspecting the remains of harvest. Ahead, even before you see the trouble, you hear it men's voices raised in that strained flat tone of practical difficulty, a horse stamping, the creak and knock of timber under bad strain. The cart stands near a roadside shrine where a weather-softened saint peers down from a niche in the stone wall as though he has seen this sort of thing every week since the flood. One wheel is listed outward at an ugly angle, the axle end partly exposed, the whole wagon slumped on one side so that the barley sacks lean together in alarm. The horse hitched to it has the long-suffering face of a creature who knows perfectly well this is not his fault and expects no thanks for that fact. 3 men stand about the mess. The driver, broad and red-cheeked, looks as though he personally has been betrayed by wood, iron, weather, and probably his cousins as well. Another fellow, younger, keeps glancing from the wheel to the road and back again, as if hoping indecision might reassemble the cart. The third is a traveller with a bundle and a pilgrim badge pinned to his cloak, caught in the stoppage and trying to look sympathetic without surrendering his day to it. "There," the driver says as you arrive, pointing with the sort of drama usually reserved for comets. It just gave. Would seldom ask permission first. You tell him. You crouch by the wheel and inspect the damage. The iron tyre has held. Good. The spokes seem mostly sound. Better. But the linchpin is gone, whether sheared or shaken loose in the rut, and the road does not ask whether you're ready for it. It simply presents itself in mud, ruts, and quiet indifference. And today it does so with a particular sense of mischief. The morning has come clear but cold, the kind of cold that stiffens fingers before you have quite admitted to yourself that they are stiff. Frost lies in the hollows like a thin white memory, while the higher ground shows damp earth beginning to soften again. It is a day balanced between firmness and collapse. which is exactly the sort of day when something breaks. You are halfway beyond the last cottages, heading toward a stand of bare trees where the road narrows and dips, when you hear it a sharp, hollow crack, followed by the drawn-out complaint of wood under strain. Then a man's voice, already tired of the situation. No. You round the bend and find the scene laid out with the quiet inevitability of trouble. A small cart has tilted to one side, one wheel sunk awkwardly into a rut, and the other standing at an angle that no respectable wheel should ever consider. The load sacks of grain. By the look of them leans like a conspiracy against balance. Beside it stands a traveller, cloak muddied at the hem, hands on hips, staring at the broken wheel with the hollow gaze of a man who knows this will take time. The dog trots ahead, inspects the situation, and sits down as if settling in for entertainment. Well, you say, setting down your tools, that wheel has strong opinions. The traveller turns, relief and irritation mingling in his expression. It had weaker ones an hour ago. You step closer and crouch by the damage. One of the spokes has split near the hub, and the strain has twisted the rim just enough to make the whole thing untrustworthy. Not a complete ruin, but not something that will carry weight much farther without intervention. Even now, it is hard to tell whether broken things choose their moment or whether you simply notice them more when they inconvenience you. Some swear that carts fail at crossroads because of spirits that linger where paths meet. Others insist it is nothing more mystical than poor road surfaces and overburdened axles. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, though everyone agrees that a broken wheel feels like an act of personal betrayal. "You're not a wheelwright," the man says, eyeing your satchel. "No," you reply, "but wood is wood, and trouble is trouble." He considers this, then steps aside with the air of a man willing to believe in any reasonable miracle. The first task is not repair, but understanding. You run your hand along the rim, test the loosened spoke, press gently against the hub. The wood creaks in reply. It is tired, worn from travel, perhaps never quite right to begin with. Still, it can be persuaded to last a little longer, and sometimes, in this world, a little longer is all anyone truly asks. You unload part of the cart first, because no repair holds while weight presses against it. The grain sacks are heavier than they look. Of course, everything in medieval life is heavier than it looks. You and the traveller work together, lifting, stacking them carefully on the roadside, away from the worst of the mud. The cold air fills your lungs sharply, and your hands begin to remember their work as movement warms them. Once the load is lightened, you lift the cart slightly, wedging a block beneath the axle to steady it. The broken spoke comes free with some persuasion, splintered along the grain where strain found its weakness. You study the break. "Did you hit something?" you ask. "Only the road," he says. Yes, you nod, the road often hits back. You search your satchel and the roadside for something usable. A proper replacement spoke would be shaped carefully, fitted with precision, but that is a workshop luxury. Here, on a cold road with a cart leaning toward disaster, you work with what exists, a length of straight wood from your spare pieces, not perfect, but sound. You trim it down, shaving with the knife, testing against the gap, adjusting again. The traveller watches, shifting from foot to foot, as if impatience might speed your hands. It will not. You work slowly, always slowly. The makeshift spoke must sit firm enough to hold, even if only until the next town. You carve the ends, fit them into place, tap gently with the mallet, check the tension of the rim, not too tight, not loose. just enough to share the burden without pretending to replace the original strength entirely. Some swear that a wheel repaired on the roadside should be tapped 3 times against the earth before moving again, to wake it properly. Others say a muttered blessing over the hub will keep it from failing before sunset. No one can quite agree whether carts understand such gestures, but many travellers perform them anyway, because uncertainty invites ritual like cold invites fire. When the spoke is set, you reinforce it with a binding of cord drawn tight across the weakened section. It is not elegant, it is not permanent, but it will hold. You step back and motion for the traveller to test it. He grips the cart, pushes gently. The wheel turns, a little stiff, but true enough. He pushes again, more firmly this time. It holds. There, you say, it will take you to the next village. After that, find a wheelwright who owes you kindness. He laughs, the tension breaking from his shoulders. I will owe him coin, I think. That also helps. Together you reload the sacks, slower this time, more mindful of balance. The cart settles back onto the road with a new, cautious dignity. The traveller adjusts the harness, checks the bindings, then looks at you with that particular expression of gratitude people carry when inconvenience has been interrupted. I don't have much, he says, reaching into his pouch. You take what he offers without counting it here in the cold. Payment is not always about fairness in the moment. Sometimes it is about the fact that work was needed and work was done. As he prepares to move on, he pauses. You saved me half a day, maybe more. Then walk the other half carefully. You reply. He nods, flicks the reins, and the cart creaks forward, the repaired wheel turning with cautious loyalty. You watch it go for a moment, the sound of it fading into the quiet road, until it becomes just another part of the morning. The dog rises, stretches, and looks at you as if to say, well, that was worth stopping for. You pick up your tools again and continue along the road, boots pressing into the softening ground, breath steady in the cold air. The fields stretch out on either side, pale and waiting, somewhere far off. A bell sounds faintly, marking time for people who are not thinking about wheels at all. And yet this too is part of the craft. Not just doors and benches and beams under abbey roofs, but broken wheels on quiet roads, small rescues of wood from failure, brief moments where patience becomes the difference between delay and movement. These are not the tasks anyone writes down in ledgers or praises in halls, but they are the ones that keep the world turning, quite literally, from one muddy mile to the next. By the time you return toward the town, the sun has climbed a little higher, though it gives no real warmth. The workshop waits, the bench ready, the half-burned candle still there from last night. There will be more work. There is always more work. But for now, as you step back into the familiar smell of oak and iron and old effort, you carry with you the quiet satisfaction of a morning spent not in making something new, but in keeping something from failing too soon. And in a life built on patience, that is often enough. By the time the light begins to thin toward afternoon, the town is already turning its mind toward the coming feast. Not a grand royal occasion, not one of those painted book celebrations where banners snap from towers and every table groans theatrically beneath whole boars, but the more familiar village sought a communal meal in the hall near the churchyard, some ale, some bread, some stewed meat if fortune has smiled on the butcher, and the annual scramble to make ordinary furniture behave as though it has been planning this dignity all year. These gatherings may speak in the language of fellowship and custom, but beneath them lies a hidden foundation of trestles, boards, benches, pegs, and hurried repairs, human warmth, it turns out, requires an alarming amount of carpentry. You hear of it first from the sexton's nephew, who arrives at the workshop with his hair full of cold wind and his words tumbling over one another. The hall boards must be set out by tomorrow evening. 2 trestles have gone lame. 1 long table plank rocks on its supports. A bench near the hearth has developed what he calls a surprising opinion about balance, and because no medieval undertaking is complete without at least one final indignity, someone has found that the side shelf where trenchers are usually stacked now leans forward like a gossip eager for details. All of this, naturally, becomes urgent at once. You set down the plane you have just lifted and look at him. So the feast has discovered gravity. He blinks, I think yes, in several places. That sounds about right. The dog, stretched among the shavings, opens one eye as if to confirm that human beings never gather in numbers without first inventing structural problems. Then he goes back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that you, unfortunately, will deal with them. You gather tools, spare pegs, wedges, cord, a small pot of glue, and 2 lengths of seasoned ash you had meant to save for calmer purposes. Calmer purposes, however, have a habit of losing arguments to collective dining. Outside, the air holds that thin winter brightness which makes every sound seem cleaner and every shadow a little more exact. The lane is busy with purposeful movement, women carrying baskets, boys sent on errands at a run. A butcher's helper half dragging, half persuading a crate, a pair of girls bearing folded linen toward the hall. From the abbey across the river the bells drift clear and measured, while from somewhere near the market square comes the smell of onions frying in fat. The whole town has begun leaning toward evening before evening has arrived. The hall stands near the churchyard, a timbered structure with stone footings and a roof blackened by years of smoke rising from feast fires, winter meetings, wedding meals, and every other excuse people have found to sit closely together and eat. The door stands open when you arrive, and cold light falls across a scene of practical disorder. Benches are pulled askew, trestles lean against the wall like exhausted soldiers, boards are stacked on the rush-strewn floor, and the stale sweet scent of old reeds, wood smoke, and damp wool lingers in the air. It is the smell of many gatherings layered over time. Inside, 3 people are already arguing gently over cloths, trenchers, and whether the better candles should be used now or save for a saint's day more likely to impress heaven. At the centre of it all stands the churchwarden, a man who wears responsibility like a cloak 2 sizes too large, and compensates by speaking as though everything depends upon the prompt arrival of his own opinions. "You've come," he says, "as though you had considered otherwise. I heard the benches were planning rebellion. They are unreliable, like most creatures asked to bear too much." He makes a noise that may be agreement, though his attention is already darting toward the trestles. Trestles first, then. That is wise. A feast may survive awkward cloths and less than ideal candle placement, but not a table that folds itself halfway through serving. You kneel by the first pair, one leg splays slightly where the mortise is worn, and the brace pin is nearly worked free. The second pair shows a small split where too much weight, too much damp, and too many years of communal confidence have all met in the same unfortunate spot. Nothing beyond remedy, but certainly beyond mere optimism. You set the sounder pair upright, test the plank across them, and watch the wobble announce itself. Yes. A table prepared to embarrass everyone in the middle of a prayer. Even now, it is hard to tell whether furniture grows old more from use or from being taken for granted. A hall bench may hold generations of boots, elbows, cloaks, drowsy children, gossiping widows, nervous brides, solemn mourners, and men who sit as if personally offended by the existence of seating. No one thanks it. They simply notice the one evening it becomes unsteady. Such is the fate of useful things. You start with tightening the worn joint. Out comes the old pin, smooth from long service. You shave a new peg, slightly thicker, tapering it just enough to drive cleanly. Tap, test, tap again. The ash bites in well, then a thin wedge, carefully set where the leg had begun to loosen, enough to restore dignity without splitting the member. The trestle stiffens under your hands. Good, not perfect. But then neither are most people who will soon be leaning over it with ale. Some swear that trestles used for feast boards ought never be mended on the very day of the meal, because hurried wood remembers panic and passes it into the evening. Others say a table that has heard blessings before eating will stand more firmly than one used only for bargaining and complaints. No one can quite agree whether furniture absorbs the character of the gatherings it serves, though anyone who has sat at both a wedding board and a manor accounting table might be tempted to believe it. The churchwarden hovers, naturally. He asks twice how long the repairs will take, and once whether one broken bench might simply be placed against the wall for the lighter guests. You decline to explore the diplomatic consequences of assigning people to seating by structural risk. Instead, you set him to finding dry wedges and to sweeping a clearer space near the hearth where the better light falls. This has the added benefit of moving him several paces away from your elbows. The bench by the hearth proves worse than expected. One front leg remains sound, but the rail on one side has slipped just enough to let the whole frame twist when weight comes unevenly upon it, which, in a feast hall, it always will. People do not sit symmetrically after ale. That is perhaps one of the few constants in history. You tip the bench, inspect the tenon, and find wear, old glue, and the weary looseness of a piece long relied upon and seldom lifted for honest repair. So you do what patience always asks, take it apart just enough to put it back better. Nearby, women begin airing tablecloths over a line strung indoors, because the cold outside is dry enough to stiffen linen into moral instruction. A girl carries beeswax candles in a basket, setting them carefully on a side chest while trying not to let her sleeves brush the flame of the hearth. Someone arrives with trenchers, someone else with a sack of coarse bread. The hall fills steadily with little signs of the feast to come, yet here at floor level. Amid rushes and shavings and old bench joints, the celebration still depends on the same unglamorous truth if the wood fails, the evening sours. You clean the joint, scrape away the old glue, pare the tin and shoulder true again, and fit it back with fresh adhesive and a new peg. Then you brace it while the hold settles and move to the side shelf. This shelf, fixed against the wall, has indeed begun leaning forward. A cracked support beneath has given way, and the whole thing waits only for a stack of trenchers or a careless shoulder to make a public point. You remove the broken brace, measure a new one from the ash length you brought, and shape it there on the spot. The plane curls up pale ribbons that fall onto the rushes and mix with bits of old straw. The hall smells suddenly of fresh-cut wood, and for a moment the whole room feels less like a site of hurried preparation and more like a workshop made communal. The sexton's nephew, to his credit, proves handy enough with holding pieces steady and fetching what is needed. He watches closely as you fit the new brace. Will it hold? If people stop treating shelves like ladders? He nods solemnly, which suggests someone absolutely has treated it like a ladder. From outside comes the sound of geese objecting to something unseen, and farther away the bells mark another hour. The winter light has shifted from bright, thin silver toward a lower gold. Smoke from the hearth climbs into the rafters and hangs there among old soot and faint traces of many previous meals. Somewhere in the churchyard, a dog barks, answered at once by your own companion near the doorway, who seems keen to remind the world that he too has views on public order. By late afternoon the trestles stand firmer, the shelf sits right against the wall, and the bench by the hearth has regained enough honesty to face the evening with composure. But there is always one more task. There is always one more thing. In this case it is a long table plank whose underside has worn unevenly where it rests on the trestles, making it rock no matter how the supports are shifted. The churchwarden suggests cloth might disguise it. This is the sort of idea people have when they do not understand the difference between appearance and consequence. So you turn the board, sight the underside, mark the high points, and plane just enough away to calm its temper. Long strokes, check. Again, not too much, never too much. The sexton's nephew braces the far end while you work. The shavings gather pale against the darker rushes, and the smell of clean oak rises warm beneath the hall smoke. Some swear that if the first table laid for a feast is sprinkled with a few drops of ale before the meal, the gathering will pass without quarrel. Others claim the old custom was breadcrumbs at the threshold for wandering souls or hungry luck. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, but the churchwarden, you notice, has placed a small evergreen sprig above the hall door. Whether that is for decoration, devotion, or simple habit, who can say? Medieval people like their practical measures accompanied by just enough hopeful ritual to keep the dark from feeling too close. At last the board settles true. You set it across the mended trestles and press down at one end, then the other. No rock. Good. Very good. The churchwarden does the same, perhaps hoping the wood will confess different feelings to him. It does not. That will serve, he says, which from him is nearly lyrical. The women begin laying cloths in earnest now, smoothing linen over the restored tables. Beeswax candles are set in place. Trenchers stack neatly on the once leaning shelf. A boy comes in with a bundle of rushes to freshen the floor. Their green scent rises bright and clean over the older, flattened layer beneath. Someone laughs near the door. Someone else begins discussing whether smoked fish should be placed at the nearer end or farther from the fire. The hall is no longer a problem to be solved. It is becoming itself again. You step back and look at what has changed. Not much, if one is inattentive. Everything, if one understands gatherings. The benches stand without treachery. The shelf no longer courts disaster. The tables sit firm enough to bear bowls of pottage, loaves of bread, pitchers of ale, elbows, laughter, arguments, toasts, crumbs, wax drippings, and all the ordinary weight of human company. This is the quiet architecture of celebration. The churchwarden pays you with more reluctance than speed, but less argument than expected, which in such matters counts as blessing. Before you leave, one of the women presses into your hand a heel of bread and a small piece of cheese from tomorrow's stores, so you do not go home empty. You thank her and eat it standing by the hearth, warming your back while the hall continues to fill around you with preparations. The dog appears at your knee as if summoned by the smell of cheese and receives his fair ecclesiastical portion. Outside, dusk has begun settling over the churchyard. The air grows bluer, colder, softer around the edges. Smoke rises from nearby roofs. A bell sounds once more, and the evening gathers the town inward toward supper, prayer, and whatever stories will be shared tomorrow at the feast. You shoulder your tools and step back into the lane. Behind you, in the hall, cloths are being straightened, candles trimmed, benches aligned. Before you, the road home lies frosted at the edges and damp in the ruts. Your hands ache pleasantly from the day's work, and there is sawdust clinging to your sleeves. Nothing you repaired today will be praised in speeches. No one will lift a cup to the trestles. Yet if all goes well, that is exactly the point. People will eat, laugh, lean, and remain entirely unaware of how near they came to a very public intimacy with the floor. And as you walk home beneath the deepening winter sky, that old lesson returns once more. As steady as bells, the warmth of a communal gathering is built long before the first candle is lit, by patient hands in cold halls, setting the hidden wood right. Night settles early now, and with it comes that particular medieval darkness which is never merely the absence of light, but a whole substance in itself, thick and surrounding, pressing close to shutters, seeping through cracks, leaning against the door as though hoping to be let in. By the time you reach the workshop after the day's labour at the feast hall, the lane is already half lost in shadow. Only a few house windows glow through oiled cloth or narrow shutters, and each glow looks small and private against the cold blue-black of the evening. Smoke hangs low under the still air. Somewhere a child is called indoors. Somewhere a bucket knocks against a well frame, and over everything, from far across the river, the abbey bells sound again, softened now by distance and night until they seem less like metal and more like memory. You ought, perhaps, to go home, eat your bread in peace, warm your hands, and let the day close. That would be sensible. It would also ignore the unfinished commission leaning in the workshop corner, the cloth merchant's chess bench for his wife's chamber, the one he described with the earnest fussiness of a man who wants practical storage to feel vaguely aristocratic. It will not complete itself out of courtesy, nor will tomorrow's errand shrink to make room for it. So you lift the latch, step inside, and begin the more secret kind of labour, the labour done after dusk when the world narrows to tool, flame, and patience. The workshop greets you with familiar smells, though they are altered by the cold: oak dust, old smoke, linseed oil, tallow, damp wool from your cloak, and the faint sharp tang of iron where tools rest on their hooks. The dog circles twice in the shavings, then settles by the door with the weary confidence of a creature who has accepted your habits as regrettable but consistent. The half-burned candle from yesterday's work waits on the bench, but tonight it will not do alone. You need steadier light, so you trim a fresh tallow dip, set it in its holder, and touch flame to wick. The light that rises is humble but determined. It spills amber over the bench, across the plane, the square, the wrapped chisels, and the boards you set out for the chest bench. Beyond that little pool, the workshop recedes into softer shadow. Night work always feels as though the world has been reduced to what the flame can reach. Everything else, the lane, the town, the churchyard, the market square, the manor gate, the abbey roofs withdraws and leaves you alone with wood and time. This piece, unlike a plain stool or a repaired shutter, asks for more than mere soundness. The merchant wants a chest to store blankets and linens, but also a bench suitable to sit upon, and also, because human vanity rarely stops at usefulness, a thing with a touch of grace at the edges, not enough to be fine furniture, just enough to let a household feel it has improved itself. So you begin with the front board, already planned, and mark the line where the lid will sit and the side joints must meet. The knife whispers through the grain. The shadow of your hand lies long and wavering in the candlelight. Even now, it is hard to tell whether night makes a craftsman more careful or merely more aware of his need for care. By day, light forgives a little. It reveals mistakes plainly enough, but it also steadies the eye. By tallow light, every line must be trusted twice once by the eye, and once by the fingertips, you lean closer. You hold the board at angles to catch the candle glow. You run your thumb along the knife mark, too deep, and the line will speak too loudly when joined, too shallow. And it will vanish in the work to come. So much of carpentry is in these tiny negotiations, invisible to everyone except the one whose hand makes them. Outside, footsteps pass in the lane, then fade. A man coughs, a woman laughs once, low and tired, and a door closes. Then the quiet gathers again. You hear the tallow wick faintly hiss. The dog sighs in his sleep. Your plane takes a long, smooth shaving from the board, and the curl falls pale as butter in the candlelight. Some swear that work done after dark should never begin with a new blade, because fresh sharpness in uncertain light invites overconfidence. Others say a candle snuffed by itself, while joinery is underway, means the wood resents the task and ought to be left until morning. No one can quite agree whether night labour is unlucky or merely demanding, though nearly everyone prefers not to trust it unless pressed by necessity. You understand why. Darkness adds uncertainty to every motion. Yet necessity, like winter, rarely consults preferences. You fit the side panel next, marking for the joints that will hold it to the front. Mortise and tenon again, though smaller here, more confined, asking for delicacy rather than strength. The chisel work must be exact. Too much pressure, and the wall of the mortise will split. Too little, and the fit will drift loose. You strike the mallet softly, careful not to jar the candle. Tap, lever, clear, tap again. The workshop seems to breathe around each small sound. The tallow light changes the wood's appearance, warming pale grain into honey and throwing every tool shadow long and solemn across the bench. It almost flatters the place. In daylight, the workshop is practical, dusty, full of little cluttered truths. At night it becomes intimate, secretive, a place where labour feels closer to prayer than trade. Not because the work is holier, but because repetition in darkness has a way of quieting everything but intention. You pause once to eat the heel of bread left from the hall, with a bit of cheese and the last of a small onion wrapped in cloth. Supper, like so many things in this life, is functional rather than dramatic. Still, eaten beside the candle and the brazier's faint glow, it feels sufficient. The dog opens one eye at the smell of cheese and receives a scrap for his unwavering commitment to attendance. Outside, the bells ring the later hour, slow and spaced, and for a moment the whole town seems to exhale. Then back to work. The lid boards must be joined cleanly if the merchant's wife is not to spend the winter discovering drafts in her linen chest. You line up the pieces, edge to edge, and check them again under the light. One board sits a whisper proud. You plane it down with 2 careful passes. Better. Another has a knot near the rear edge. Not dangerous, but enough to threaten stubbornness when the hinge straps go on. You mark its place in charcoal so you will remember not to trust it blindly later. Wood always keeps one little secret in reserve. There is a lesser-known custom, or perhaps only an old workshop superstition, that says a new chest ought never be closed fully the first night it is assembled. Some say it lets the wood settle. Others say it gives household spirits a chance to inspect the workmanship and depart peacefully. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, but many makers prop the lid open with the shaving curl or peg before delivering it. You've done so yourself once or twice, half from habit, half from politeness toward uncertainties no one has time to define. By now the chest sides are fitted dry on the bench, their lines squarer than they first appeared in the merchant's imagination, and you allow yourself the quiet pleasure of seeing a useful object emerge from separate, doubtful boards. This is perhaps the most reassuring part of the craft. Not the finishing, not the payment, not even the praise when it comes. The moment when loose pieces first begin to stand in relation to one another and suggest they may endure. A shape is appearing, a volume, a promise. You peg one corner, then another, only enough to hold the structure while you test the lid frame. The candle flame wavers in a draught from the wall, and the shadows shiver over the boards. Instantly your whole body stills. Night work teaches this too. When the light shifts, the hand stops. No cut is worth making by a flame you do not trust. You rise, stuff a little wool into the crack where the air sneaks through, and shield the candle until it steadies again. Only then do you return to the chisel. It is slow, this pace, almost absurdly slow. But slowness is what keeps the piece honest. A merchant may ask for quick work. A winter calendar may crowd the week. The body may ache and the bed may call to you from some future hour. None of that improves a joint. So you go on, mark, pare, test, adjust, fit, again and again until the lid sits right on its frame and the front edge meets without boast or gap. The night deepens. The sounds outside grow fewer. Once, much later. A cart passes somewhere in the lane, its wheel creaking in the cold like an old man turning in sleep. Once, a voice rises in the alehouse direction, then is shushed by distance or common sense. Beyond that there is mostly the workshop and its own private weather-warm tallow, cooling wood, the rasp of steel, the dry hiss of shavings brushing the floor. At last you stop to flex your hands and feel how tired they have become. Not clumsy tired, not yet, but approaching it. This too is part of patience, knowing when endurance begins to threaten judgment. You look at the chest bench as it stands half assembled in the candlelight. The body is together, the lid frame is fitted. The decorative shaping at the edges can wait for daylight, as can the final hinge setting. To continue now would be possible. It would also be foolish. Night work is a test of trust, yes, but also of restraint. So you set the tools aside one by one, the plane hung back on its peg, the chisel wiped and wrapped, the square laid flat, the charcoal tucked away. You brush the bench clear with the side of your hand, and the shavings fall in soft curls to the floor around your boots. The dog lifts his head, senses the shift in the room, and rises. Before snuffing the candle, you rest a hand on the chest bench. The wood is smooth and faintly warm where your hands have worked it, cool elsewhere. Unfinished, yes, but no longer only boards. It has crossed into being. Tomorrow it will take hinges, shaping, final pegs, and perhaps the merchant's inevitable second thoughts. Tonight it has earned its pause. You pinch the wick out. Darkness folds inward at once, leaving only the brazier's dull red eye and the vague pale form of the workshop shutter. For a breath or two you stand in it, hearing the building settle, the dog's quiet movement near the door, the far-off bells dissolving into the cold. Then you step out into the lane, pull the door close behind you, and let the night take back the town. The air bites cleanly at your face. Smoke hangs low. Frost is beginning again at the edges of the road, somewhere beyond the roofs, unseen. The Abbey Tower keeps its silence until the next hour must be marked. And you walk home through that deep medieval dark with tired hands and oak dust on your sleeves, carrying the peculiar peace that comes from work left at the right moment, not finished, not abandoned, but trusted to wait until morning light can tell the truth again. Morning comes pale and sharp, the sort of winter morning that makes every surface seem more certain than it really is. The lane outside the workshop has stiffened in the night, the mud at its edges crusted into brittle ridges, and the puddles carry a film of ice thin enough to crack like old glass beneath a careless boot. Smoke rises straight for once, not blown sideways, and the air tastes of frost, ash, and distant river water. When you unlatch the workshop door and step inside, the cold has settled over everything with an almost ceremonial thoroughness. The bench is cold, the tools are cold. The half-finished chess bench from last night stands in the dimness like a thought you went to sleep holding and woke still carrying. You light the fire first, because even patience benefits from warm fingers. Then the candle, because the daylight beyond the shutter is still weak and blues with dawn. The dog, who has by now made your workshop part of his official territory, circles into the shavings and collapses with the immediate seriousness of a creature who knows someone else will be doing the difficult part, sensible, outside, somewhere beyond the roofs. The abbey bells begin their morning measure, and the sound reaches you cleanly through the frozen air, as if the whole town has been washed overnight and hung out to dry. Today the larger commission must rise properly into itself. The merchant's chest bench, begun by tallow light and prudence, now waits for daylight's judgment. This is always a strange moment in the craft. Night gives intimacy, focus, and a certain modest courage. Morning gives truth. A line that looked straight by candle may wander under pale winter sun. A fit that seemed close enough at dusk may reveal its vanity by dawn. So you stand a while beside the piece, hands wrapped around a cup of warm ale, and simply look. The body holds well. The corners remain square. The lid sits true on its frame. Good, very good, even. There is still work to do. Of course there is always work to do, but the shape has settled into honesty. It no longer looks like separate boards pretending to cooperate. It looks like an object preparing to belong to the world. That is the quiet reward of long patience, the day when something begins to stand on its own authority. You set the chess bench on trestles and begin with the shaping. The merchant asked for presents, which is the sort of word customers use when they want ornament but wish to sound sensible while requesting it. So you do not carve saints, vines, or heraldic beasts, not for this purse and not for this house, but you ease the front edges, round the corners slightly, and plane a gentle bevel along the lower rail so the piece catches light with more grace than a plain box would. Little touches. Enough to please a chamber, not enough to start delusions of nobility. The plane murmurs over the wood in long, soft passes. Pale ribbons gather at your feet. The smell is warm and dry now as the fire strengthens oak, ash, tallow, a hint of iron, and yesterday's labour lingering in the room like a memory. You stop often to look from different angles. Good shaping is never only about cutting, it is about restraint. Leave too much, and the piece remains blunt and heavy. Take too much, and it starts trying to be finer than it can afford. The best furniture in a town like this knows what it is. It does not pretend to have been born in a castle. Some swear that a new household chest should have one hidden mark on its underside, a little sign known only to the maker, so that luck may recognize it and return. Others say such marks merely help a craftsman remember his own work later, when someone comes to complain in spring that the lid has a mood. No one can quite agree whether such signs belong to superstition or practical memory. Yet many pieces carry them all the same: a knife nick, a scratched cross, a tiny pattern cut where no customer will ever see. You have known men who would never admit to charms and still always mark the underside of a lid. By mid-morning the merchant himself arrives, wrapped in a good cloak and carrying the indoor chill of a man who has walked briskly while thinking mostly about expense. He ducks into the workshop, glances toward the fire, then to the chest bench, and stops. For once he says nothing immediately. That is promising. He walks around it with his hands behind his back, the universal posture of men preparing either to approve something or to become tiresome about it. He lifts the lid, tests the balance, runs 2 fingers along the front bevel, sits on the bench portion, stands again, then crouches to examine the lower rail as if he suspects hidden luxury. It is sturdier than I imagined, he says. This is, in customer language, a compliment with a beard on it. You imagined something less likely to outlive you. He almost smiles. Almost. My wife wanted somewhere to store blankets by the wall near the hearth, but also a place to sit while her maid brushes her hair. A common architectural problem. He chooses not to notice the joke, which is a pity, but not a new experience. Together you discuss the hinges. He had mentioned wanting iron straps visible, and you show him where they will sit strong enough to hold, simple enough not to look foolish, and placed so the lid opens cleanly without binding. He nods, then asks whether the front might bear some small line or detail to keep it from feeling plain. Of course! This is the moment every larger commission eventually reaches. The object is nearly done, which means the customer suddenly discovers a decorative appetite previously hidden beneath all practical conversation. Fortunately, you had expected this. You take a scrap of charcoal and mark out a simple field on the front, not carved ornament exactly, but a framed panel line works shallowly into the surface, enough to give shadow and shape, a suggestion of formality, nothing more. The merchant looks relieved, as if elegance has been rescued from disaster by a line he could not previously have named. That, he says, yes, that will do. It so often will. Once he leaves, promising to send a servant at dusk or tomorrow morning depending on the household's arrangements, you begin the hinge fitting, iron and wood again, always a negotiation, never a friendship. The straps lie black against the warmed oak, and you mark the seats carefully before cutting the shallow mortices. The chisel bites, the shavings curl, the fit is tested, then tested again. Winter light shifts over the bench as the morning ripens, turning from pale blue to a thin gold that catches every flaw and praises none of them. Good. Let it be honest. Outside the town continues its own day cartwheels, muted voices, a cockerel with unrealistic faith in his own influence, the clink of a smith at work, the distant call of a woman selling something hot from a pot. Somewhere a broken cartwheel from yesterday may already be receiving a proper replacement. Somewhere in the feast hall, the mended trestles and benches now hold ordinary life without ceremony. Somewhere in the Abbey guest house passage, the brace you reset rests quietly overhead while brothers move beneath it unaware. These little continuities gather around you as you work, each one a reminder that patience is cumulative. No day stands alone. It builds on the last like joinery. Even now it is hard to tell which part of a larger commission teaches patience most deeply, the slow building itself, or the repeated refusal to improve it past its rightful nature. This chess bench could be carved more. The lid could be heavier. The corners could be fussier. The front could bear little tracery or shallow flowers or some foolish animal, if one were in a particularly reckless mood. But that would be vanity dressed as craft. Better to make it well, proportion it honestly, and leave the rest to candlelight and household pride. You cut the shallow panel lines on the front with knife and straight edge. They are simple, but in the morning light they give the piece just enough depth to feel considered. A shadow lies in each scored line. The whole front grows calmer, more finished, more itself. There is an old belief, found here and there in villages and among older craftsmen, that large wooden pieces ought to be tapped 3 times after final assembly, once for strength, once for peace in the house, and once so the wood remembers its shape. Others laugh and say 3 taps simply help settle the joints and satisfy the maker's nerves. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, but when the hinges are finally on, and the lid opens and closes with that quiet, heavy certainty you wanted from the start, you find yourself tapping the top lightly with your fingertips all the same. By afternoon the piece is ready to stand free of the trestles. You lower it to the floor and step back. It sits there in the workshop as if it had always intended to occupy space this way. Solid, calm, not ornate, but not mean either. A useful thing with enough grace to be loved a little, the best kind. You oil the iron lightly and rub the wood with cloth until the surface deepens in tone. Not glossy, this is not court furniture, and you're not a conjurer, but richer, warmer, the grain rising visibly in the light. The bench top invites a hand, the lid lifts smoothly. The storage within is generous enough for blankets, linens, winter cloaks, perhaps a little cedar or dried lavender tucked among them if the merchant's wife is sensible and dislikes moths. Some swear lavender in a chest pleases not only the household, but any saints passing invisibly through it. Others say the saints have better things to do than inspect blanket storage. Still, dried herbs, sprigs of rosemary, little linen sachets of sweet hay or crushed leaves find their way into boxes and chests everywhere, because people want the things they open each day to offer more than utility. They want a breath of comfort too. Late in the day, the merchant's servant arrives with a handcart and the expression of a man who has already been sent on 4 unrelated errands and expects this to become a 5th in spirit. Together you lift the chest bench out of the workshop and into the winter light. It is heavier than it looks, naturally. Everything honest usually is. The servant grunts. You guide the corners. The dog supervises. The road to the merchant's house is not long, and you go with the piece because larger work deserves to be placed properly. The chamber where it is meant to stand lies on the inner side of the house near the hearth wall. Just as described, it is a better room than many, hung with woven cloth against the draught. With a chest already in one corner, a bench by the window, fur-lined cloaks on pegs, and a narrow table holding a polished metal mirror that flatters no one without candlelight. The merchant's wife is there, wrapped in dark wool, her hair partly braided, and when she sees the piece brought in, her face alters in that small, unmistakable way satisfaction arrives before words. You set the chest bench beneath the wall hanging, near enough the fire to feel companionable but not so near as to abuse the wood. Good, very good. The proportions sit well in the room. The wife lifts the lid, nods once, then sits lightly upon the bench and lets her hand travel over the front panel line. It feels settled, she says. That is the finest word anyone has offered all day. Her maid brings folded wool blankets to test the depth. They fit. The lid closes. The bench stands true beneath her weight. The merchant, arriving a moment later, looks both pleased and as though he had always expected this outcome with perfect confidence. It would be cruel to question the performance. Payment is made. Fair payment, not generous, not mean. Enough. The sort of sum that says the labour has been respected even if not fully understood. You take it, bow your head slightly, and leave the piece there in its new place, already beginning its second life among household sounds, brushing, folding, quiet talk, the crackle of fire, the movements of linen and winter clothing and domestic time. When you step back into the lane, dusk is gathering again at the corner of the town. Smoke lies blue above the roofs. A bell sounds from the abbey. Somewhere a child laughs before being called in. Somewhere a door closes on a lit room and a bowl of pottage. The dog falls into step beside you, and your hands, though aching, feel lighter now that the work has left them. A larger commission has a peculiar aftertaste, not triumph exactly, more a long exhalation, weeks of choosing, measuring, planing, fitting, pausing, rethinking, trimming, resisting haste, ignoring decorative foolishness, and returning each time to what the object truly needed. All of it now gathered into one finished thing standing against weather and time in another person's chamber. And as you walk back toward the workshop through the deepening winter evening, you understand more clearly than before that mastery in this craft does not arrive like lightning. It accumulates, it settles, it takes shape the way the chest bench did piece by piece, correction by correction. Patience warms smooth into judgment until at last something stands before you that can bear weight without complaint. By the time the last section of winter light begins slipping away behind the roofs and bare hedges, the day has the stillness of something nearly finished, not empty, not idle, but complete in the quiet medieval way that comes only after long labour has passed through enough hands, enough rooms, enough weather, and left its marks in wood rather than in words. You return from the merchant's house with coin in your pouch, oak dust still caught in the weave of your sleeves, and the deep, settled ache that follows work done properly. The lane is darkening at the edges. Smoke rises low and blue from cottage chimneys. A bell from the abbey drifts over the river and across the frosted fields, softer now, as if the whole world is being called not to prayer exactly, but to rest. The workshop receives you in the old familiar way with cold air first, then the dry smell of oak, old shavings, tallow, iron, and soot. The bench waits where it always has. The half-burned candle, now little more than a stub, leans beside the newer one. The square hangs on its peg. The plane rests where you left it. Even the floor, with its drift of shavings in the corners and its scuffed path from bench to door, seems to hold the memory of these weeks inside it. Here is where the miller's door began resisting you. Here the damp days slowed everything to patience alone. Here the chest lid, the stool, the alehouse bench, the herb box, the shutter fittings, the merchant's chest bench all passed through your hands. Here the dog chose his corner and stayed. Here the bells found you morning after morning, and here they find you again tonight. You do not rush now. There is no need. That may be the clearest sign of all that something inside the work has come to its end. You set a small flame to the tallow candle. Its light blooms softly over the bench, across the grain of the wood, along the edge of the tools. Outside, the last pale colour drains from the shutter crack and leaves only shadow. Inside, the room gathers close and warm enough to be kind. You begin by cleaning. It is not dramatic work, but then neither is most of what matters. You wipe the chisel blades with an oiled rag, careful at the edges. You check the bindings on the mallet handle. You brush dust from the plane mouth and run your thumb, not along the blade but near enough to respect it. You coil the line. You sort the pegs that remain. These little acts, performed at the end of a day and at the end of a long run of labour, feel less like chores than acknowledgements. The tools have borne their part. They deserve to be put by in order. Some swear that if a carpenter leaves his square crooked on the bench overnight, the next day's work will wander with it. Others insist a tool laid carelessly invites household spirits to borrow it, and spirits, being poor craftsmen, return things blunter than they found them. No one can quite agree whether these beliefs belong to common sense or old imagination dressed in work clothes. But every good craftsman, whether he admits it or not, leaves a workshop more orderly than he found it when a season of labour has been especially full. The dog lifts his head as you move about, then settles again with a long sigh, his muzzle on his paws, the very picture of earned fatigue. He has followed you through manor mud, abbey yards, market noise, winter lanes, and late-night candlelit joinery. He has inspected roads, storehouses, feast halls, and thresholds. A suspicious monk never quite trusted him, but everyone else seems to have yielded to his solemn authority. Even now, with the workshop settling into evening, his presence feels like another old wooden object in the room, quiet, dependable, and entirely woven into the place. You set a little stick on the embers and warm your hands. The fire answers gently. No crackling triumph, just a small red life under ash. The same kind of warmth that has kept so many mornings possible. In that dim glow and candlelight, the workshop seems almost to retreat from time. Not modern, not old, simply itself. A place where patience has been practiced enough to wear smooth the rougher edges of both wood and person. Even now, it is hard to tell when a man becomes master of his craft. There is no bell for it. No priest appears with a relic and a certificate. No one in the square suddenly begins addressing your joints with respect. What comes instead is quieter. You begin to notice that your hands pause in the right places without being told, that your eye sees the mischief in a board before the saw does, that you know when to stop because darkness lies, when to wait because damp air changes everything, when to refuse a foolish decorative idea because the object itself wants dignity more than ornament. Mastery, if that is the word, arrives like weathered wood slowly, in the grain, almost without announcement. You sit on the bench at last, not to work, only to rest, and look around the room with the candle wavering softly beside you. The callbacks of these days gather themselves quietly. The smell of wet wool from the damp afternoon, when the rain kept the miller's door leaning indoors. The half-burned candle from the night you stopped before foolishness. The memory of the broken cartwheel on the road, and the old storekeeper testing her repaired door in the manor. The abbey roof beam settling easier above the guest-house passage. The feast hall benches now holding laughter without collapse. The merchant's wife laying blankets into the chess bench and calling it settled. All of it built not from one grand effort, but from many small refusals to hurry. Outside, somewhere beyond the lane, laughter drifts briefly from an alehouse and is swallowed by the cold. Then a bell, then silence again. Winter silence, not empty, full of hidden things, distant fires, sleeping livestock, breath under blankets, rushes on floors, shutters latched against the dark, saints' tokens hanging by bedsides, herbs drying in rafters, iron keys at belts, wool cloaks over pegs. People trusting wood and hinges and latches they scarcely thought about because you made them trustworthy enough to forget. That, perhaps, is the carpenter's deepest reward. Not praise, not wealth, not even the finished object standing proudly in its place. It is the invisible part, the way life goes on more comfortably because of work no one needs to mention. A door closes properly, and a draft stays out. A shutter fits, and a child sleeps warmer. A roof beam holds, and travellers never notice the trouble that might have been. A bench remains steady beneath weary bodies. A chest keeps blankets dry. A gate no longer drags. A shelf bears its load. A wheel turns one more day. The world does not celebrate these things because the world has the luxury of not seeing them fail. You lean back a little, listening to the workshop breathe. The candle lowers. The shadows lengthen. The dog dreams, his paws twitching once as if still trotting ahead of you on some muddy road, and slowly, with the fire dimming and the town settling beyond the door, the shape of this long labour becomes plain. Why did being a medieval carpenter require endless patience? Because nothing in this world arrives ready. Not timber, not weather, not customers, not roads, not roofs, not gates, not walls, not even your own hands on a cold morning. Everything asks to be looked at, tested, mistrusted gently, and brought into line a little at a time. Wood remembers the tree it was. Iron carries the forge into every hinge. Stone shifts. Damp enters. Winter tightens. Summer swells. People ask the impossible and call it urgent. And through all of it, you stand at the bench. In the yard, on the road, by the gatehouse, in the roof space, in the feast hall, by candlelight, by brazier glow, by the first bell and the last, learning over and over that force is noisy, but patience is what holds. No one can quite agree whether patience is a virtue, a skill, or simply the tax the world charges for making anything worth keeping. But in your life, it has been all three. It has lived in your shoulders when lifting a sagging gate, in your fingertips when testing a knife line, in your silence when a merchant discovered taste late in the process, in your restraint when rain insisted on delay, in your caution when tallow light made the edges uncertain. It has been less like heroism than endurance made gentle, less like glory than steadiness repeated until it becomes character. You rise at last, because even reflections eventually require practical endings. You snuff the candle down to a low glow and cover the embers a little, leaving enough life there for morning. You take one last look around the workshop, the bench, the pegs, the tools, the shavings, the shutter, the old familiar order of it all, and then you open the door. The night outside is soft and deep. Frost glimmers faintly where the lane catches starlight. The abbey bells do not ring now. The whole town seems to have folded in on itself, warm at its little centres and dark between them. You step out, and the dog rises to follow, as of course he does. You close the workshop behind you with the quiet confidence of a man who knows there will be more work tomorrow, more boards, more repairs, more weather, more ordinary problems disguised as urgencies. But you also know something else now, something as steady as oak and as plain as a peg driven true. Your life has been built exactly as good timber work is built, not in haste, not for show, but by long attention paid daily until strength and calm became the same thing. And so you walk slowly home through the medieval dark, carrying the smell of wood smoke and planed oak with you, while behind shuttered windows the world rests within the patient shape your hands have helped make. The fire at home is lower now, only a red softness under ash, and when you kneel to stir it, sparks lift gently like tiny gold insects before fading. The room gathers around you with its familiar textures, the wool blanket folded on the pallet, the rushes on the floor, the iron hook by the hearth, the coarse bread wrapped for morning, the cloak hanging from its peg, still edged with dried mud at the hem. Everything is small, plain, used, and enough. You sit once more, just long enough to feel the warmth return to your hands, and the long road of these days begins, at last, to loosen. Outside, there are no more errands, no voices, no bargaining, no hammering from the smith, no cartwheels grumbling in the lane, only the quiet breath of winter night and the far unseen river moving through the dark. Your shoulders soften, your thoughts lengthen and lose their edges. The workshop, the manor, the abbey, the market, the feast hall, the road, All of it seems to drift a little farther away, not gone, only gentler now, like scenes painted on old parchment by candlelight. You think of the miller's door closing against the cold, of the chess bench standing by the hearth wall, of the mended bench in the hall, of the shutter holding fast, of the roof beam settled again in its place. So many small acts of patience, each one disappearing into someone else's comfort. It is a tender thing, when you let yourself feel it, a humble thing too, and perhaps that is why it soothes you now. Nothing needed grandeur, nothing asked for legend. It only asked to be made sound, to be made kind, to be made to last a little longer in a world of damp, smoke, winter air, and worn hands. The dog circles down near the hearth with a sigh and rests his head on his paws. The fire lowers, the shadows blur. Your own breath grows slower, easier, and the room seems warmer for no reason except that the day is truly done. There is no need to plan tomorrow yet. No need to judge the weather, to inspect the timber, to measure, to mark, to pare, to fit. For this little while, you can simply be still. And in that stillness, the whole medieval world softens. The bells grow distant, the roads lie quiet, the roofs hold, the doors stay latched, the candles burn low, and every rough wooden thing you touch seems to settle deeper into peace. The night closes kindly around stone, timber, straw, and sleep. The dark is no longer pressing at the shutters, it is only waiting gently beyond them. Your hands are warm, your work is done. The embers glow like patient stars. So you let the room dim, let the fire hush, let the long old world drift farther and farther into a calm, safe darkness, until there is nothing left to carry but warmth, and nothing left to hear but quiet.